The prolonged conflict in Ukraine, now stretching well into its third year, has witnessed relentless Ukrainian resilience against formidable odds. While Russian forces have claimed minor territorial gains since the fall of Avdiivka in February, the reality is that these are costly and largely symbolic. Ukraine's strategic countermaneuvers and the staunch defense of key positions like northern Donetsk Oblast and the areas surrounding Bakhmut and Vuhledar in Zaporizhia Oblast underscore a narrative not just of survival, but of calculated resistance. This strategic endurance is all the more remarkable given Ukraine's current artillery challenges. Dubbed shell hunger, this shortfall has seen daily artillery discharges dwindle from 10,000 shells to roughly 2,000. This, coupled with damage to many Ukrainian howitzers due to precise Russian counter-battery efforts and new drone tactics, has undeniably strained Ukraine's defensive capabilities. Yet despite these setbacks, the spirit of Ukrainian forces remains unbroken. In contrast to the narrative of Russian advancement, the reality of the battlefield tells a different story. Russian forces, despite an extensive artillery arsenal and support from rogue states like North Korea, are achieving only marginal gains at an unsustainable cost. Their reliance on volume over tactical efficiency has not translated into decisive success, highlighting the inefficiencies and desperation underlying their military strategy. Amid these challenging dynamics, a beacon of support shines from Denmark. This Scandinavian ally has stepped up, ready to alter the course of events with significant artillery contributions. This move is not just a military aid package, it's a symbol of a shifting European foreign policy landscape that increasingly seeks to support Ukraine's staunch defense efforts. But how transformative could Denmark's involvement be, and what does this mean for the balance of power on the front lines? As Ukraine's defense minister Rustem Umerov advocates for more Western artillery and ammunition, Denmark's commitment could very well be a game-changer. Providing the much-needed artillery might not only alleviate Ukraine's shell hunger, but could also empower Ukrainian forces to reclaim momentum. This support from Denmark and other Western nations underscores a collective international commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and resilience, setting the stage for a pivotal shift in the ongoing conflict. But how exactly is Denmark stepping up in this crucial hour? Before we explore their pivotal contributions, let's rewind to the events that set this commitment in motion. Just 2 days after the fall of Avdiivka, a bold announcement came from the north. Denmark pledged to donate all of its existing artillery units to Ukraine. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen broke sharply with Europe's cautious stance on arms support, criticizing the continent's hesitancy and highlighting the available resources. This is not only a question about production, because we have weapons, we have ammunition, we have air defenses that we don't have to use ourselves at the moment, that we should deliver to Ukraine. With this declaration, Denmark not only promised critical military support, but also challenged other nations to reassess their positions. You see, to prove the point that such a donation would not be crippling to its arsenal, Denmark's Ministry of Defense said it was in the process of acquiring new military capabilities on a rapid basis to make up for the loss of units. In Munich, Frederiksen also stressed the importance of not waiting for a politically divided United States to take the lead on supplying the Ukrainians. It doesn't matter what the US comes up with. We Europeans have to defend ourselves. This is a war on the European continent. Frederiksen's remarks were the latest example of Denmark's evolving geopolitical strategy, and it's helpful to see Copenhagen's artillery donation in that light. Although Denmark was one of the founding members of the NATO alliance in 1949 and played a pivotal geostrategic role thanks to its control of the Baltic's western choke points, its overall level of security integration with the rest of Europe was not as well advanced. Until June 2022, Denmark was the only one of the European nation's 27 member states which did not participate in the latter's common security policy. Denmark did not take part in the EU defense discussions, nor get involved with the joint military missions. These opt-outs originated with Denmark's initial rejection of the Maastricht Treaty in a 1992 referendum. To secure Denmark's accession to the European Union, Copenhagen was granted a number of exceptions to the Maastricht Treaty through the Edinburgh Agreement. One of these involved defense issues. With these opt-outs in place, Danish voters agreed to join the EU on such terms in a second referendum the following year. This security opt-out policy was in tradition with Denmark's Cold War footing. Although it was a member of NATO, Denmark did not allow any foreign forces on its soil under the alliance's auspices. The Soviet Union was the dominant power in the Baltic and had troops in nearby Germany, troops which outnumbered the West's. Denmark wanted to place itself under America's nuclear umbrella, but did not otherwise want to risk upsetting the Soviet Union. Recent historical experience reminded Danish policymakers of the importance of this goal. British forces only barely prevented the Red Army from pushing on to Denmark when they captured the city of Lübeck in northern Germany on May 2, 1945, only hours before Soviet troops came into the area. The Soviet Union had also occupied the Danish island of Bornholm, which sits on strategic territory in the Baltic, since the previous year. Bornholm is an island roughly in the middle of the strait between Sweden's southern coast and Poland's northern one. A military presence there can cut off movement between east and west in the Baltic. Fortunately for the Danes on Bornholm, Stalin agreed to withdraw the Red Army from the island and did so in April 1946, thus making it a rare example of the Iron Curtain receding in the immediate post-World War II era. However, Stalin's move only came with the understanding that Denmark would not host foreign troops on its soil, even though it was in the West's sphere of influence. American and British policymakers quietly agreed about this, and the unspoken agreement held throughout the Cold War. After the Cold War ended, Denmark slackened on its defense spending. It last spent 2% of its GDP on defense in 1989 and fell to a low of 1.1% in 2015. But that's now starting to change too, as it further integrated itself with European and NATO security networks and gradually ended the policy of quasi-neutrality. Denmark also pledged that it would increase its defense spending and hit the 2% mark by 2033, although there will undoubtedly be many voices in the West that say this rate of increase is too slow. Either way, recent moves in Denmark suggest that its long period of relative military neutrality is coming to an end, and this policy shift has been sanctioned by Danish voters. On June 1, 2022, Denmark held a referendum that asked a simple question. Do you vote yes or no on Denmark being able to participate in the European defense and security cooperation by abolishing the EU defense opt-out? Amidst Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Danish voters chose yes by a margin of nearly 67 to 32%. The vote therefore ended Copenhagen's comparative military isolation from the rest of Europe. The result meant that Danish troops could participate in joint military operations under the EU's banner and have more of an influence in joint European defense policy. More importantly, the result of the referendum made it far easier for the Danish military to acquire weapons and equipment, which is one of the reasons why Copenhagen understands that it can donate all of its artillery to Ukraine. Russia reacted negatively to the news and stopped supplying natural gas to one of Denmark's power companies. Although this did not significantly affect Denmark's energy supply, the move was another demonstration of Russia's willingness to use coercive methods as a means of statecraft. These maneuvers on the part of Moscow likely only further convinced Danish voters that they had made the right decision. Even before the invasion, Denmark was signaling the beginning of its seismic shift in security policy. As Russia was gathering its forces along the Ukrainian border and an invasion seemed imminent, PM Frederiksen suggested that negotiations were ongoing with the United States on a new bilateral defense agreement that could station American troops and military equipment on Danish soil for the first time. Danish Defense Minister Morten Bødskov said any new agreement would be designed to give American forces better access to Europe. The agreement would also likely allow for more cross-training between American and Danish troops, and perhaps more importantly, could make acquiring new military equipment and ammunition easier for the Danes. Once it joined the broader European defense community, Denmark demonstrated its disproportionate willingness to supply Ukraine. It's one of the major donors of F-16 fighter jets, supplying the Ukrainians with 19 of them, which should be sent out by 2025. This is the broader context behind Denmark's more recent decision to donate all of its artillery to Ukraine. Copenhagen's donation of artillery amounts to a small sum, as it has no MLRS units or towed artillery. Rather, the GFI lists Denmark as having 19 self-propelled artillery units, with 15 of them being in a state of readiness. These units are the French-made Caesar self-propelled howitzer. The Caesar entered service in 2008 and has an operational range of about 600 kilometers, with a crew between 3 and 5 operators. Each unit has a typical magazine of 36 shells. The Caesar fires NATO standard 155mm ammunition, up to a range of 34 kilometers and up to 42 kilometers when using an extended range full-bore shell, ERFB. These rounds were originally designed by the Canadian artillery engineer Gerard Bull, who became famous for working on the concept of Saddam Hussein's Project Babylon superguns, Big Babylon and Baby Babylon. Bull was assassinated in 1990, possibly by Israeli agents who did not want to see the Iraqis' superguns become a reality. Unlike standard rounds, these shells are longer and thinner. ERFB rounds have peculiar nubs around their midsections, which help to engage the rifling in the gun and stabilize the projectile in flight, although later ERFB rounds may not have these. ERFB rounds have significantly increased range compared to a standard shell, but at the cost of reduced accuracy. The decreased accuracy has meant that the ERFB round has not become a NATO standard, but the Caesar is nevertheless capable of firing it. The Caesar can increase its range even further, up to a range of 52 kilometers, when it uses rocket-assisted shells. Each Caesar costs about $7.5 million per unit, but the pricing depends on individual contracts. As an example, the acquisition of 52 Caesar howitzers was approved by the Czech Ministry of Defense on September 1, 2021, and the value of that contract is around $288 million. The Caesar has to this point performed well in the war. Correlation does not necessarily equal causation, but it may be more than coincidental that after Ukraine started to receive its Caesar guns, Russian artillery units began to suffer heavy losses. Its introduction, therefore, seems to have coincided with better Ukrainian counter-battery fire. At the height of the Ukrainian gunners' effectiveness, the Russians were supposedly losing between 20 and 40 artillery systems per day. Unfortunately for the Ukrainians, the Caesar was not enough to turn the tide, as the Russians dug in with the benefit of the most elaborate network of fortifications seen in Europe since the First World War. Ukraine's Zaporizhia campaign failed to reach even its first objective, the road junction at Tokmak. As of April 2024, the Oryx blog lists a visually confirmed 8 losses of Caesar units. 5 have been destroyed and 3 damaged. Denmark's donation of its 19 Caesars comes amid new French donations of the unit. Sensing the desperate shortage of artillery for the Ukrainians, France announced in January that it intended to deliver an additional 78 Caesar units to Ukraine and sought €280 million to assist with 60 of these. While Denmark was already sending all of its Caesar artillery units to Ukraine by April 2023, Fredriksson's remarks in Munich were an announcement that it would be sending a different system there too. In addition to the Caesar units, Denmark has 21 X-21 Cardon mortars, which will now be on their way to Ukraine. The Cardon was originally created in Israel and can be chambered to fire 81 or 120mm shells. The 120mm Cordon is muzzle-loaded, but despite this, the mortar has a burst rate of 16 rounds per minute and a sustained rate of fire of around 4 rounds per minute. The Cardon operates on an autonomous recoil system and is controlled by computers, although it can be laid and targeted manually with its backup handles and optical sights if the computerized fire control is compromised. The Cardon has an effective range of about 7.2 kilometers. To improve accuracy, the Danes decided to equip their Cardon mortars with MVRS 700SC muzzle velocity radar systems manufactured by their domestic Weibel company. This system takes account of atmospheric conditions like temperature and humidity, which influence the conditions in the barrel and therefore the muzzle velocity of the mortar's round, which in turn influences the accuracy of its fire. The MVRS 700SC's presence allows the Danish Cardon systems to compensate for environmental conditions and improve their accuracy. This radar system is integrated with the Cardon's computerized fire control system through an antenna and a processor. The Danes received the Cardon in 2019 and specifically sought to use it as mobile firepower. Following Russia's original intervention in Ukraine in 2014, one of the lessons Denmark took away was the vulnerability of artillery to counter battery fire thanks to radar and drone detection. To adapt to this reality, the Danes decided to integrate the Israeli Cardon mortar with their new Piranha 5 armored personnel carrier. The integration better allows the Cardon to deliver fire support and then move away before the enemy can spot it and retaliate. Denmark's decision to send its entire artillery force to Ukraine is the latest sign of a gradually changing philosophy among the Western powers. As the war commenced, Western nations were cautious about escalating the conflict, hesitating to supply Ukraine with high-impact weaponry such as long-range ballistic and cruise missiles. This cautious stance began to shift dramatically in 2023, marked by significant support, including main battle tanks, cluster bombs, Storm Shadow cruise missiles, and the pivotal American ATACMS for Ukraine's HIMARS units. Despite these substantial commitments, which initially raised concerns about escalation, the successful utilization of these systems by Ukraine in 2022 helped to alleviate fears, shifting the focus toward the potential depletion of Western arsenals. Years of peace, along with a focus on counter-terrorism, had not prepared the West for the intense demands of modern, high-intensity warfare, where sophisticated ammunition is consumed at an alarming rate. This concern is compounded by the complexity and vulnerability of the supply chains needed to produce and distribute modern precision munitions. Yet the Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen argued that supporting Ukraine, even at the expense of Western stockpiles, was a strategic necessity. In her view, a Russian defeat in Ukraine would ultimately enhance Western security more reliably than maintaining large arsenals at home. While Denmark's contribution of artillery might not decisively tip the scales of the war, Frederiksen hoped her bold move would catalyze broader European support, encouraging a more substantial collective effort. This hope seemed to be materializing when, at a Munich conference, Czech defense official Jan Jiras revealed that 800,000 artillery shells could be procured from non-Western stockpiles for Ukraine at a cost of $1.5 billion, proposing a feasible solution to swiftly bolster Ukraine's artillery capabilities. His announcement underscored a growing willingness among European nations to find innovative ways to support Ukraine's defense and maintain the momentum in its counteroffensive efforts. On March 8th, Czech President Petr Pavel announced that a group of 18 countries had funded the purchase of all of those shells in full. Germany alone would buy 180,000 rounds with a price tag of $618 million, which amounted to 40% of the total. Denmark also participated in the financing alongside Belgium, the Netherlands, and Canada. The effort that Denmark contributed to resulted in the procurement of about 400,000 of the shells. At about the same time, the Czechs identified a further 700,000 idle artillery shells that could be purchased for $1.8 billion. Ukraine's Western allies, including Denmark, have agreed to purchase these also. Thanks to Europe's collective efforts, Ukraine's artillery and shell shortage looks like it will end by this summer, when the Czech-brokered ammunition begins to arrive. The expected date of delivery is June. As the summer matures, Ukraine might begin to fire around 6,000 shells per day, 3 times as many as now. The number might grow further to 10,000 per day, now that the divided United States Congress has decided to deliver additional aid. Ukraine's shell hunger is about to end. And the way in which it will come to an end is an item of evidence in favor of PM Frederiksen's notion of the need for Europe to take the lead in its own defense. For her, defeating Russia in Ukraine now, even if it means a depletion of valuable military stockpiles at home, is a preferable option to using those weapons in a future on one's own doorstep in another, worse conflict down the line. But will the rest of Europe follow suit? Do you agree with PM Frederiksen? Should Western countries send much more of their available arsenals to Ukraine? Is this the best way for Europe to secure itself from future Russian aggression? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons to help the channel and for more military analysis from military experts. Now go and check out why Russia can't stop US weapons, or click this other video instead. After the fall of Avdiivka in February 2024, French President Emmanuel Macron stated that the West should do everything it could to make sure Russia does not prevail in Ukraine. He pointed out that past taboos, like sending long-range missiles to the Ukrainian military, had already been broken. Therefore, the West should not rule out potentially putting boots on the ground. Macron, who called the meeting where he made these remarks, represented a nation whose higher-ups are increasingly worried about the Russian economy's transition to a wartime footing. To the French, such a transition and its contribution to renewed Russian effectiveness on the battlefield greatly threatens the security of Europe. Europe would therefore need to see to its defense and the maintenance of a first-rate domestic defense industry. As part of this broader security focus, France is rearming again and bidding to reclaim the place it had occupied for centuries, the most powerful military state on the European continent. In this video, we will look at France's arms buildup and what its efforts mean for Europe's broader defense posture. Despite its reputation, France has long been a large military spender in Europe. Even in the period of peace after the end of the Cold War, France never fell far below NATO's 2% benchmark. Its lowest military expenditure between 1991 and 2022 was 1.8% of GDP. In January 2023, Paris announced it would increase military spending by more than a third between 2024 and 2030. The result is that the military budget would have doubled since President Macron came to office in 2017. In addressing this new increase, Macron acknowledged that the post-Cold War era, which he called a peace dividend, had come to an end. The new military spending, he said, would be designed to make France a forward-thinking military, capable of being one war ahead. Major investments in the new build-up would include drones, cyber warfare, and intelligence. The strategy would be one designed to fight a peer or near-peer conflict, as opposed to the asymmetric operations France has long taken part in on the African continent, which mostly involve rapid skirmishes and counterinsurgency operations with low-level firepower. France is currently ranked as the world's 11th most powerful military in the Global Firepower Index. It has a 200,000-strong active-duty army with an additional 26,000 in reserve and 150,000 paramilitary personnel. It has a robust air force with 972 total aircraft. 224 of these are fighters, 118 are transports, 140 are trainers, 44 are special mission planes, 17 are tankers, and 447 are helicopters, 69 of which are of the attack variety. On the ground, France is a lot more vulnerable. It only has 222 active tanks, and not all of them are ready to be deployed. It has over 85,000 other military vehicles, but only 96 self-propelled artillery units, 9 multiple launch rockets or MLRS systems, and no towed artillery units. These rankings were current as of January 2024. This comparatively small stockpile is a big problem for the French and Europe, as the war in Ukraine has revealed how rapidly these assets can be destroyed in a peer or near-peer conflict. Russia's tank losses have been notorious, but even at the height of its effectiveness in the summer and autumn of 2022, Ukraine was still losing 2 tanks a day, which would only give the active French tank fleet a few months before depletion. To address these deficiencies, France began a 20-year military modernization program called Project Scorpion, which began its concept phase in 2010 and officially launched in 2014. That date was no coincidence, as it marked the start of the troubles in Ukraine. Russia's actions back then signaled to Paris that the post-Cold War peace dividend might be on its last legs. The next year, France reversed its trend of budget cuts to its military and began to spend more on defense. In 2016, the French government pledged $6.7 billion over the following 11 years as part of the Scorpion program. A major part of this program is to modernize France's tanks and vehicles. Project Scorpion set out to upgrade 200 Leclerc main battle tanks as the centerpiece of its vehicle-centric focus. Additionally, there are ongoing upgrades to over 1,800 Griffon armored personnel carriers and 978 Serval vehicles. New procurements have been part of the armored build-up too, with France setting out to acquire over 2,000 new Serval VBMRL vehicles, 625 new VBCI infantry fighting vehicles, and 300 new EBRC Jaguar armored reconnaissance vehicles. The Jaguar was introduced into service in 2022 and is a major improvement over the earlier AMX-10RC and ERC-90 Sagaï vehicles, which are steadily being retired. The Jaguar is a good choice not only for reconnaissance, but also as a fire support platform. Its 40mm cannon, MPP anti-tank missiles, and remote-controlled 7.62mm machine gun are well suited to making it a mobile firepower unit. It also has smoke grenade launchers to help protect it from enemy fire. It has a top speed of 90 km per hour and a range of 800 km. The Jaguar is cheap, and it saves expenses on both of the earlier vehicles it replaced, and it uses the same chassis as the VBMR Griffon, which in turn is based on a commercial truck chassis. Although the price of €1 million was the original intent, the vehicle's sophistication and enhanced capabilities led to a unit price of approximately €5 million. Many of the parts needed for the Jaguar can instead be adapted from civilian sources. The Jaguar is therefore capable but also easily replaceable in a peer or near-peer conflict, making it ideal for France's new focus on high-intensity, state-based warfare. The upgrades to the VBMR Griffon have the same idea in mind. All of the Project Scorpion upgrades and new acquisitions have been done under the operations of a consortium of French companies. Such a move was meant to ensure a robust domestic defense sector. The companies involved in this initiative included Nexter, Thales, and Renault Trucks Defense. The first 689 of the new Serval VBMRL vehicles are expected to enter service by next year. As mentioned, military intelligence capabilities are a key part of the Scorpion buildup. Specifically, France seeks to emulate the data-sharing attributes of the United States Armed Forces, which allow unprecedented interoperability of arms to destroy targets as needed. For example, an F-35 fighter jet could use its stealth qualities to penetrate an enemy air defense zone and find a target of opportunity. But rather than giving away its position by opening its internal weapons bay to fire a missile, it can call upon a cruise missile strike from a ship at sea or an artillery strike from a HIMARS system hundreds of miles away, sharing the precise coordinates of the enemy through its unprecedented sensor fusion and situational awareness. Although ground forces are not quite as capable, France is looking to increase its vehicles' situational awareness. This part of Project Scorpion is called Combined Collaborative Combat. As an example, the Jaguar is loaded with sensors and electronic warfare measures. It has an Antares missile alert system that has 360-degree coverage and the Thales barge, an active jamming device that interferes with improvised explosive devices. There is also an acoustic sensor mounted to the roof to spot enemy gunfire. This is called the Metravi Pilar V. The Antares system will also be equipped on the upgraded Leclercs and Griffon APCs. Providing the new vehicles with improved situational awareness will help to create a smarter military, capable of sharing data between branches and creating something like a French kill web. An example might be a Jaguar using its sophisticated sensors to approach an enemy attack position. This would normally be dangerous, but the accurate data it will provide would then be sent to air or artillery support to wipe out the enemy tanks and move on to the next task. This is the way in which more lightly armed American soldiers in Iraq were often able to get the better of Iraqi tank units. So France's new vehicles, while not being quite as capable as those of the United States, will still provide intelligent, powerful, and reliable platforms for its armed forces. They will also be far more replaceable, meaning that the French economy would not need to spend years retooling for a war in order to make them producible at the scale needed to deal with the attrition rate of a peer-based battlefield. In contrast, vehicles like the US Army's Stryker infantry carrier require much more specialized parts that will be difficult to produce in a peacetime economy. Aside from its hardware upgrades and new procurements, Project Scorpion aims to enhance interoperability between the armies of Europe. For example, Belgium has cooperated with France in producing the Jaguar, and it too operates the vehicle. In 2019, Belgium announced it would buy at least 60 Jaguars and 382 Griffons. This makes cross-training and shared logistics between the two countries easier. Indeed, Belgium has cooperated with France in supporting and operating the vehicles. In 2021, Luxembourg was assessing whether it too should join France's Project Scorpion. For President Macron, this inter-European cooperation is an essential part of his strategy for France. Years before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, he was one of several prominent European policymakers urging the necessity of a security posture for Europe that was independent of the United States. To him, while American cooperation and the NATO alliance remains essential, Europe needed to do more to create a stable security framework through its own actions, especially given the turbulent domestic politics in the United States and a shifting foreign policy focus in Washington. European countries, in other words, could no longer afford to be the free riders that President Obama and Trump had accused them of being. The war in Ukraine and dwindling American support as its presidential election year ramped up spurred his comments in February 2024. "We cannot wait for the outcome of the American elections to decide what our future is going to be. It's the future of Europe that's at stake, so therefore it's up to the Europeans to decide. If others want to join in and help, fantastic, but that's just an added bonus." Macron insisted that Europe must take the lead in supplying Ukraine with badly needed ammunition and must further buttress a domestic defense industry. He supported Estonia's idea for the European Union to issue defense bonds for such a purpose, although the Germans and Dutch are so far resistant to this proposal. The expansion of Project Scorpion to include other countries in Europe would be a natural evolution of this philosophy. France has already fielded a Scorpion modernized brigade and plans to field its first Scorpion modernized armored division next year. However, the French have no plans to stop with Project Scorpion. More recently, Paris has announced a second phase of the broader military modernization push, a phase it calls Project Titan, which was launched in 2018. While Scorpion largely focused on France's fleet of lighter vehicles, Titan's primary objective will be to modernize and better equip the country with heavier instruments of war, such as tanks, artillery, helicopters, and aircraft. Titan's primary objective is to deliver the necessary combined arms equipment for high-intensity, state-based warfare as part of an all-aspect approach to warfare. According to Charles Baudouin, a retired general in the French army who led Scorpion in the technical section, Titan will aim to aggregate the lower-intensity experiences seen in the War on Terror with the higher-intensity type of warfare seen in Ukraine. Strategies to counter anti-access area denial systems are a big part of Project Titan, and France is carefully studying how this A2AD environment might evolve before it makes big purchases. As the action in Ukraine has revealed the importance of rapid infantry response and situational awareness via drones, Paris is likely pleased with the emphasis of the earlier Project Scorpion, and a new push to make capable drones is natural. France is also well aware that these lighter, more mobile forces have defeated heavier units such as tanks through the use of systems like portable anti-armor weapons and even commercial drones armed with anti-tank grenades. A study of these emerging realities will influence the purchases and improvements of heavy equipment under Titan. The emphasis on situational awareness and data sharing seen in Project Scorpion will be continued in Titan. As part of this focus, the French Army is working with the Procurement Office to create a high-capacity data network set to enter service after 2040. In May 2022, Arnaud Goujon, a colonel in the French Army who was attending a conference on land weapons hosted by France's Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique think tank, described the effort as a strategy of simultaneity. He mentioned that Titan was not just about platforms, in other words, it was about software as much as hardware. Extending a combat cloud for the country's ground forces is a way to follow up on Project Scorpion's drive to deliver lighter and medium vehicles to the French military and further improve their situational awareness. As part of this, the French plan to use a next-generation communication system that calls on metadata and is enhanced with artificial intelligence to speed up data sharing and decision-making. All Project Scorpion vehicles will be upgraded with the breakthroughs that Titan produces, enabling an extension of their service life, which is important because even the new Jaguar will be entering the middle of its ordinarily expected service life by the time Titan updates are all finished. Titan partially aims to cover the gaps that Project Scorpion will leave in its wake once it's completed. One of the bigger gaps in Scorpion was the relative lack of defense against anti-tank missiles and drones. The French brass also expects the new Titan-produced vehicles to come with intelligent robotics, at least in a few cases. Once the French brass gets a complete review on the demands for heavy equipment on the modern battlefield, Project Titan plans for a number of hardware upgrades. The centerpiece of these upgrades will be a successor to the Leclerc tank, which has been in service since the early 1990s. Details are sparse as to whether this is officially a part of Project Titan, but France and Germany have been collaborating on a new tank since at least 2018. Back then, the Leopard's manufacturer, Germany's KMW company, and France's Nexter Defense Systems, which makes the Leclerc, collaborated to produce a hybrid of the two tanks and demonstrated their capacity to work together. France and Germany have decided to create a next-generation main battle tank under the moniker of Main Ground Combat System. The two countries intend to replace their respective main battle tanks with the product of the MGCS by 2040. In 2018, Janes noted that the date could be moved up a few years because the collaboration between the two countries was already well advanced. There are also reportedly unmanned systems to go along with the new tank. The two countries are also working on a new artillery project called the Common Indirect Fire System. This will be a self-propelled howitzer which will replace France's Caesar and Germany's PZH-2000. This new artillery is expected to enter service by around 2035. In building the new artillery system, Titan will draw on two European Union studies on future artillery systems. These are the Future Indirect Fires European Solution (FIRES) and the European Common Long-Range Indirect Fire Support System (ECOLORS). These studies each got a budget of almost $4 million and are expected to be completed this year. FIRES will look at potential next-generation 155mm artillery shells and rockets, while ECOLORS will consider an improved European 155mm cannon and whether this and a rocket launcher can be mounted on a hybrid truck. The French are looking to the skies as well, hoping that Titan will create a next-generation helicopter to replace the Tiger, which came into service in the 1990s. Project Titan also aims to create a replacement for the Mistral 3. The Mistral is a family of short-range air defense missile systems that can be deployed from vehicles, ships, helicopters, and even in a portable configuration. Development of this system began in 1974 and it entered service in 1989. The Mistral 3 boasts better imaging processing abilities and enhanced engagement against targets that have minimal heat signatures, such as drones, turbojet-powered missiles, and fast attack craft at distances up to 7.5 kilometers. The Mistral 3 is also resistant against electronic warfare countermeasures. The Titan replacement will presumably improve on these attributes. It will be a mobile, ground-to-air, low-altitude system. Baudouin claims that Project Titan aims to offer total superiority by 2050. Obstacles remain for the project, however. For example, it's unclear if the MCGS project will go off without a hitch. The potential for the French and Germans to reduce their level of cooperation in the face of pressures from competing interests from other companies who want a place at the table remains. These are companies such as Germany's Rheinmetall and Krauss-Maffei-Wegmann, who have expressed their intention to be part of the new tank project. Rheinmetall is also working on its own new tank, the KF-51 Panther, which it began developing in 2016. It plans to target Leopard operators for sales of this tank. Meanwhile, another competing tank, the Enhanced Main Battle Tank, might also threaten the MCGS. This vehicle is manufactured by the aforementioned KNDS. Both companies would naturally like to see their projects prevail over the MCGS idea. Nevertheless, France is banking that Project Titan will successfully enhance its military capabilities. Paris is confident enough that it's looking even further into the future than Titan. Perhaps this is because of the ongoing success of Project Scorpion, which has generally delivered its ambitions on time and on budget. Looking further ahead, there's also Project Vulcan, which invests heavily in cyber warfare and will attempt to make the French army compatible with modern robotics by 2040. Another part of the war in Ukraine that France has tried to internalize is the renewed power of defensive armaments and the role that new technologies held by civilians plays on the modern battlefield. For example, civilians equipped with smartphones and drones can help to transmit the locations and movements of armed forces to other parties, threatening operational security. Finding answers to these challenges will be an important part of France's broader military buildup. Despite its reputation in some segments of popular culture, the French military has remained a capable and experienced fighting force. However, the war in Ukraine has driven home key vulnerabilities in Paris's arsenal and approach to warfare, especially in vehicles, drones, and artillery systems. France has seen no choice but to adapt to modern geopolitical and military realities. France was long Europe's leading military power. Now, with the United States increasingly focused on countering China in the Indo-Pacific region and its uncertain domestic politics making its commitment to European security less clear, Paris once again aims to take up the mantle and create a momentum that will allow the rest of the continent to follow in its wake. If Project Scorpion, Titan, and Vulcan succeed as intended, the French will be on their way to fielding a fighting force that will not only serve Paris's needs, but have a chance to serve as the pivot of European military affairs, as it had generally between the 14th and 19th centuries. But will these projects succeed as Paris and President Macron intend? Don't forget to let us know what you think in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more military analysis from military experts. Now go and check out how the German military will become Europe's most powerful, or click this other video instead. In February 2024, French President Emmanuel Macron issued a statement that shocked the world. After a meeting in Paris of over 20 European heads of state and other Western officials, Macron issued a stark warning to Vladimir Putin: "We will do everything needed so Russia cannot win the war." If that wasn't incendiary enough, in his next breath, the French leader openly discussed the possibility of deploying Western troops to fight in Ukraine. There's no consensus today to send in an official, endorsed manner troops on the ground, but in terms of dynamics, nothing can be ruled out. Putin's response was predictably furious. According to Al Jazeera, the Russian leader had this to say on the matter: "The West has announced the possibility of sending Western military contingents to Ukraine. The consequences for possible interventionists will be way more tragic. Not for the first time in the last 2 years, the rest of the world has been left facing the very real possibility of a wider conflict that may have a nuclear conclusion." But what led us to this critical stage? If you were to take a step back and soberly assess the situation, it's easy to see why Putin was so riled by Macron's not-so-thinly veiled threats. After all, one of the main historical bones of contention for Moscow was NATO expansion into Central and Eastern Europe, most notably the establishment of a fully operational military base on Polish soil. Having been subjected to countless invasions and occupations throughout its colorful history, from Genghis Khan to Napoleon Bonaparte, Russia saw this as an act of aggression and a threat to its sovereignty. To put another great military-shaped fly into the ointment, 20,000 troops from 9 countries have recently participated in full-blown North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, exercises in Central or Eastern Europe. Where, exactly? You guessed it, northern Poland. Taking all of the above into account, how close are we to a Western troop deployment in the war in Ukraine? And would that inevitably lead to a global conflict, maybe even of World War III proportions? That's the question that we'll attempt to answer in this video. Before we begin, we must acknowledge that the mere presence of a relatively large number of US, French, and British troops in Poland could easily be interpreted as a hugely provocative act by Russia in itself. Granted, Western leaders have attempted to put a far more benign spin on the situation. Terms like testing the NATO alliance's deterrence and defense capabilities have been bandied around in the press. But because Macron has made such pointed statements of potential intent, it can easily be seen by some as adding kerosene to an already blazing fire. But what exactly were the troops doing there? Well, according to an in-depth report from Defense News, nothing more than standard military drills. Following deployment, the participating nations undertook many maneuvers, both on land and amphibious, the likes of which are seen in any training exercises conducted by any army in any part of the world. Tellingly, however, these drills included a challenging river crossing. As part of the Polish-led Dragon 24 military exercise, American, British, French, German, Spanish, Turkish, Slovenian, and Lithuanian soldiers traveled across a 320-meter section of the Vistula River. They chose this time of year to host this event, said Major General Cezary Wisniewski, a senior Polish military official, as the waterway can be difficult to navigate in early March. We wanted the most challenging conditions. The water levels of the river are very high and the winds are usually strong. The crossing involved positioning floating bridges, which then had to be loaded with tanks to navigate from the opposite side of the bank and dock safely for the vehicles to disembark and continue with their military objectives. Furthermore, a simulated crisis included the movement of many personnel and combat vehicles across Polish territory. The movement of troops is a crucial part of the exercise, said Wisniewski, especially in a situation like today where we have large formations of troops involved, with 20,000 plus military personnel and 3,500 pieces of equipment. At this point, you would be forgiven for questioning the sheer numbers involved here, over 20,000 troops and 3,500 pieces of military hardware. More statement of intent than a standard military drill. Even the least cynical amongst you must find it hard not to class such a large-scale exercise as an act of intimidation. To others, it closely resembles a warm-up before the deployment of military personnel from NATO countries to Ukrainian territory, even if they wouldn't, at this stage, be taking an active role in combat operations. All of this was corroborated in a recent statement by the Polish Ministry of Defense. While the exercises are defensive and not directed against any state, they are deemed to be a demonstration of the ability to counter any aggressive policies and proactive activities of the Russian Federation. Another broadside in Moscow's direction, if ever there was one. But perhaps there is a deeper underlying symbolism involved here, one that goes further than the military exercises on Polish soil, for these drills took place only around 100 kilometers away from Poland's border with the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad on the Baltic Sea. And again, that is something that would be a huge cause of concern for a Moscow almost obsessively paranoid about any potential incursions into its territories. Now, this area, the Suwalki Gap, or Suwalki Corridor, as it's sometimes referred to, has been of great historical importance for many years. Moreover, it acts as a choke point that could well play an incredibly vital role if Putin decides to escalate his military aims in Eastern and Central Europe. But where exactly is the Suwalki Gap, and why is it so important? The Suwalki Gap is an area around the border between Lithuania and Poland that's sparsely populated, to say the least. It represents the shortest path between Belarus and the aforementioned Russian exclave of Kaliningrad Oblast on the Polish side of the border. Named after the Polish town of Suwalki, this choke point has been of great strategic and military significance ever since Poland and the Baltic states joined NATO. The border between Poland and Lithuania was formed after the Suwalki Agreement of 1920, but it was of little importance in the interwar period, 1918 to 39. At the time, the Polish lands stretched farther northeast. During the Cold War, however, Lithuania was part of the Soviet Union, and Communist Poland was a member of the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact alliance. The eventual dissolution of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact hardened borders that cut through the shortest land route between Kaliningrad, Russian territory isolated from the mainland, and Belarus, Russia's ally. From that geographical information alone, it's clear to see why the Suwalki Gap is seen as such a key location should the war take an unexpected turn. In fact, an article from Politico shortly after the Russian invasion of Ukraine went a step further, claiming that the area is the most dangerous place on Earth. Why? Well, Western military planners warn that the Suwalki Gap would likely be one of the Russian president's first targets, were he ever to choose to ramp up the war in Ukraine into a confrontation to end all confrontations with NATO. At present, all is quiet in the area, but for how long though? Ramūnas Sepatuskas, commander of a local company of Lithuania's Riflemen's Union, a voluntary militia with roots stretching back more than a century, is monitoring the situation in the border region with growing unease and concern. For many, the Suwalki Gap is Lithuania's Achilles heel. Some think there's no point in attacking us, but it must be noted that this is a direct route to Kaliningrad, he said. If they're able to overcome Ukraine, it's possible that the next blow would fall here. And therein lies the rub, and perhaps a little more light on Macron's statements, as well as just why US, French, and British troops might just be ready to enter the fray in Ukraine. In February, Russia scored one of, if not the, biggest victories of the increasingly attritional conflict so far, the taking of the hugely important strategic Donbas city of Avdiivka. The fact that fighting, whether intermittent or heavy, has been raging since 2014 only underscores the significance of the win for Moscow. Even more worryingly, Ukrainian troops are running out of everything from effective radar equipment and military hardware to basic ammunition on the ground. But a restock of supplies is slow in coming across the board. In an interview with CBS and published by The Hill in March 2024, the beleaguered Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky made the following statement: "We don't have rounds, artillery rounds. We don't know what will be tomorrow. That's why we have to prepare." Since the beginning of the conflict, Ukraine has received unprecedented levels of military aid. According to the Council on Foreign Relations from February 2024, the US alone has pledged over $75 billion so far. Naturally, at the start of the conflict, the political goodwill was there for all to see. Citizens in Western nations in particular were appalled at Putin's act of aggression and fully backed their government's actions. Now, over 2 years down the line, people have become increasingly war-weary, especially now they are being bombarded with images of Israel's brutal war with Hamas. And this has had an inevitable knock-on effect. Back in December 23, US President Joe Biden encountered incredible difficulties in getting approval for a new military aid package for Ukraine passed through Congress. In a report from the BBC, there was huge resistance from Senate Republicans to the new $61 billion package, despite an unnamed Ukrainian official stating that failure to secure more US aid would mean a very high possibility that the war would be lost to Russia. Of course, this is the outcome no one in the West wants to see, evidenced by Macron's comments quoted at the top of the video, but the plain facts of the conflict cannot be disputed. Ukraine has received huge military backing from the West, but it now looks as if the country is slowly but surely losing the war. So is the solution yet more funding, the transport of more military hardware, bigger and better rockets and guns, more support on the ground, and more economic sanctions against Russia? In an ideal world, perhaps that would be the easiest solution, all of the above. But no war can go on in perpetuity, just as no government, no matter how well-meaning or righteous the cause they champion, has unlimited coffers. Hence, Ukraine's main allies find themselves in an invidious position where direct action might be the only way to proceed. A point emphasized by Phillips O'Brien, Professor of Strategic Studies at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. The issue of sending European forces to help Ukraine was never one to be dismissed, he said. Europe is now faced with a terrible dilemma, watching Ukraine potentially run out of ammunition or stepping in and helping Ukraine more directly. Zelensky has hinted as much himself, warning that the war could escalate to Europe. The US is helping Ukraine and we are grateful for their support, but the United States don't have the war going on. But it can come to Europe and to the United States of America. It can come very quickly to Europe. But are the leaders of countries like the US, France, and Britain really ready to act? Do they genuinely fear that a Russian victory in Ukraine may be only the start of a wider conflict in Europe and beyond? And were the drills that took place in Poland back in March actually preparations for a special military operation of their own? If so, it brings us all the way back to the Suwalki Gap. As stated, it's the only way to get by road or rail from Poland and Central Europe to the Baltic states, which are arguably NATO's most exposed members. A Russian move to seize control of the corridor may seem beyond the realm of possibility at the present time, as it would explicitly involve an attack on NATO territory, automatically triggering a US military response. Why? Article 5 of the NATO Charter. The parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all. But will Putin be cowed by Article 5 in the way much of the world assumes? Will it continue to act as a deterrent when the stakes are so much higher now? That's a question that can't be answered at this stage, but considering the Russian leader's complete disregard for international law, it would pay for the West to prepare now for the worst-case scenarios. However, the sticking point seems to be the very real concerns that increased military assistance to Ukraine, meaning direct troop deployment of the kind Macron threatened in Paris back in February, might paint the West as co-combatants in the eyes of the international law Putin himself is so happy to flout. And there's no way that any Western government, be it Biden, Macron, or UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, could risk being cast as the aggressors. History would never forgive them. If they did proceed regardless, it might give Putin the excuse he needs, and probably wants, for lashing out and launching new military offensives of his own. Namely, the Kremlin may see an increased threat to Kaliningrad and seize the Suwalki corridor to create a land bridge to the exclave. Moreover, Kaliningrad is now home to substantial Russian combat forces, including the Russian Baltic Fleet, advanced air defenses, and mobile nuclear-capable Iskander-M missiles. For that reason, Russia is hugely sensitive to any threats, real or imagined or invented, to its control of the non-contiguous territory, and might risk escalation if it misinterpreted NATO's actions near Kaliningrad. Naturally, any attempt by Putin to seize the corridor would mean an attack on Lithuania or Poland, or both, and a direct war between NATO and Russia. And like we said, this would at best be strategically unwise and at worst a precursor to World War III. But time and time again, Putin has kept the West second-guessing. There's nothing to suggest that a potential conflict over the Suwalki Gap would be any different. For now, the world can only look on with bated breath. Make no mistake though, the clock is ticking. And perhaps the country looking most concernedly at the hands traversing that metaphorical clock face is, of course, Poland. In the 20th century, the Polish people suffered terribly at the hands of two of history's most brutal dictators. In one direction, they had Hitler's all-conquering Wehrmacht, in the other, Stalin's vengeful Red Army. One intent on invading and seizing power, the other to rape, pillage, and forcibly indoctrinate the populace with their communist ideology. Put quite simply, the country became one big battlefield, with its major towns and cities being reduced to nothing more than rubble in the process. Understandably, Warsaw never wanted to be in that position again. To protect itself going into the 21st century and beyond, Poland has built one of the most modern and best-equipped armies, not just in Europe, but the whole world. Indeed, the defense minister Mariusz Błaszczak claimed that his country would soon have the most powerful land forces in Europe. Many would argue that the country already has. At the time of the making of this video, Poland has more tanks and howitzers than Germany and is on course to have a much larger army, with a target of 300,000 troops by 2035, compared with Germany's current 170,000. In terms of troop numbers, the military is about 150,000 strong, with 30,000 belonging to a new territorial defense force set up in 2017. These consist of weekend soldiers who undergo 16 days of training, followed up by refresher courses. Initially sneered at, Ukraine's success in using mobile militia equipped with anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles now makes the idea seem much more sensible. The list could go on, and it's made Poland a powerful force to be reckoned with on the global stage, to the extent that a senior US Army official sees the country playing a crucial role in supporting Ukraine and in shoring up NATO defenses in the Baltics. Poland has become our most important partner in continental Europe. So, would Putin be willing to open up another military front and launch an all-out attack on a country with such fearsome military resources at its disposal and such powerful allies? The ramifications have already been set out in this video if the ultimate answer is none the clearer. To come full circle, Macron's threats of Western troop deployment were roundly criticized by the rest of the world. For some, they were unnecessarily aggressive. For others, reckless and ill-advised. Already, the situation in Ukraine is on a knife edge and tightrope combined. With Putin seemingly happy to play the long game now, what will ultimately happen in the short to medium term is difficult to predict. In recent interviews, Zelensky has said that he fully expects the Russians to launch another full-blown offensive in the spring, with May being the most likely date. Meanwhile, predictions coming out of Moscow, both from those opposed and those firmly behind Putin's leadership, suggest that the war could drag on for another 5 to 7 years. But maybe the key factor in both the short and longer term will be the outcome of the US presidential election in November 2024. If Donald Trump were to be re-elected, it could have disastrous ramifications for Kyiv. Whether that would mean a significant reduction in military aid or the end of all financial and military support altogether is yet to be seen. Back in 2023, when asked about the Ukraine conflict, Trump was in a conciliatory mood. "I know Zelensky very well, and I know Putin very well. I would tell Zelensky no more. You've got to make a deal. I would tell Putin, if you don't make a deal, we're going to give him, Zelensky, a lot." Since then, the former president's tone has changed. Worryingly, in a CNN report from March 24, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán is quoted as saying in an interview with M1 broadcast, he, Trump, has a very clear vision. He says the following: first, he will not give a single penny for the Russo-Ukrainian war. That's why the war will end, because it's obvious that Ukraine cannot stand on its own 2 feet. If that transpires, then the whole nature of the war will, of course, be turned on its head. So perhaps the biggest question facing the likes of the US, France and Britain is just when exactly the time for procrastinating is over. To their credit, the governments of each of those countries took decisive action from the outset. They pledged huge amounts of money to bolster the Ukrainian war effort and implemented some of the harshest economic sanctions against Russia ever seen. But still, it hasn't been enough, not by a long shot. In addition to the significant military breakthroughs referenced earlier in the video, Putin has also managed to absorb the economic blows associated with the sanctions by exporting huge amounts of gas and oil to Asia, most notably to China and India, if at a drastically reduced price. In addition, military expansion in the prized Arctic region has carved a lucrative new trade route that could prove decisive in years to come. Economically, Russia looks more than capable of funding the war for as long as necessary. In fact, some business experts are of the opinion that the Russian economy is so reliant upon the war now that Moscow simply can't afford to pull out of Ukraine for the foreseeable future. Perhaps even more worryingly are rumors that Russia has been holding back some of its more advanced modern military capabilities. In a report from Reuters from February of this year, Putin claimed that 95% of Russia's strategic nuclear forces had been modernized and that the Air Force has just taken delivery of 4 new supersonic nuclear-capable bombers. If that's true, it only adds to Zelensky's woes and puts even more pressure on his allies. With a significant number of US, French, and British troops assembling close to the theater of war, and Moscow looking to make another decisive move on the geopolitical chessboard, the future couldn't be more uncertain. Whether an increasingly unlikely diplomatic solution can be found, or whether a change in the White House will force every nation's hand, is yet to be seen. But if Macron's words are anything to go by, Western troops could well be mobilized and ready to enter Ukraine sooner than anybody could ever have imagined or feared. Now we're coming to the end of the video, it's time to ask you what you think about the potential Western troop deployment in Ukraine. Was February's statement of intent no more than an empty threat from Macron to see exactly how Putin would react? Or do you think the conflict, now in its 3rd calendar year, has reached a stage where Western intervention is all but inevitable? After all, the military aid packages from NATO countries in particular are unsustainable in the long term. And with Putin's recent landslide re-election and some Russian political experts predicting a much longer war than anticipated, the time for the West to act may well be upon us. If not, Russian aggression could see the country take decisive steps into Central and maybe even Western Europe. Let us know what you think in the comments below, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out why Poland would destroy Russia in a war, or click this other video instead. Vladimir Putin's ambition to intimidate NATO with his Ukrainian invasion has spectacularly backfired. Far from sowing division and halting expansion, his actions have galvanized the alliance, boosting defense budgets across the board and ushering Finland and Sweden into the fold. How's that for unintended consequences? Previously, we explored Finland's contributions to NATO. Now, it's time to delve into Sweden's dramatic journey into the alliance. Why is Sweden's NATO membership a strategic nightmare for Putin's grand designs? For one, Sweden is seriously considering developing a 6th-generation fighter jet, and despite its historically low level of military spending, its army is highly advanced. But this is all just the tip of the iceberg. Stick around as we dive into all of the reasons Sweden terrifies Putin. Let's begin. Sweden formally applied for NATO membership alongside Finland in May 2022 in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. For both countries, it was the end of a long tradition of military non-alignment. At the time, Vladimir Putin dismissed the new developments, saying that the 2 countries joining the alliance would not constitute a threat in itself. Rather, he said that he would only consider it a threat if they deployed a new military infrastructure in their territories. The latter came with a backhanded warning of a response in kind. Privately though, Putin understood how deep of a blow this is to Russian power in Europe, and he must have been hoping that internal controversy would prevent them from joining. To admit a new member to the alliance, all NATO countries must be in agreement. Turkey stalled entry for Finland and Sweden, claiming that the 2 countries harbored members of Kurdish groups that it recognizes as terrorist organizations. Finland and Sweden's prohibition on arms exports to Turkey in response to its military operations in Syria in 2019 was also an item of complaint for the Turks. In the Turks' resistance, Vladimir Putin had a hope. Turkey is a purchaser of Russia's S-400 air defense system, which has earned it the ire of the United States. Turkey has also proven a vital lifeline for Russian energy exports and is now Moscow's 4th largest customer. Turkey has also gone through a period of democratic backsliding under Erdogan, who has been in power there in one form or another since 2003. Might the Turks prevent the 2 new countries from joining after all? Finland proved better able to overcome the Turks' objections, and it joined the alliance on April 4, 2023. Sweden, however, still saw its membership stalled, with Ankara claiming that Stockholm was being more intransigent about its concerns than Helsinki had been. At a summit in Madrid in July 2022, Sweden and Turkey agreed on renewed counter-terrorism cooperation both in and outside of NATO's framework. Additionally, NATO would establish a new office, the Special Coordinator for Counter-Terrorism. However, Turkey claimed that Sweden was dragging its feet on these commitments, particularly as the latter's courts blocked extraditions of individuals that it considered terrorists. Protests in Stockholm, where copies of the Quran were burned and Turkish President Erdogan was hanged in effigy, caused further diplomatic tension. Turkey said that this amounted to a hate crime, while the Swedes said it was an item of free expression. Then there was another obstacle. Hungary also objected to Sweden's NATO membership. Budapest's objections were not specific like Ankara's had been, but Stockholm's accusations about the supposed erosion of the rule of law under Prime Minister Viktor Orbán was an item of dispute. The Hungarians denied this and claimed that Sweden's accusations made it a less than trustworthy partner. After complicated diplomatic maneuvering, where Sweden changed some of its domestic laws and relaxed rules over its arms sales to Turkey, the Turkish parliament finally voted to permit Sweden to join NATO in January 2024. Then on February 26th, the Hungarian parliament followed suit. The two countries signed an arms deal as part of this agreement. The agreement included Budapest's purchase of 4 Gripen fighter jets and expanded pre-existing logistics contracts. Vladimir Putin's last hopes had run out. Sweden's entry into the alliance became official when it submitted its instrument of accession to the United States government, which is NATO's depository as outlined in the North Atlantic Treaty. This occurred on March 7, 2024. Although NATO has frequently been criticized for adding members of questionable utility and exposing its members to security commitments that might undermine the collective defense principle enshrined in Article 5, Sweden is not such a case, and it adds a lot to the alliance. First, Sweden's entry into the alliance brings renewed geostrategic vulnerabilities for Putin. The fall of the Soviet Union severely constrained Russia's ability to influence the Baltic. Its current projections into the sea come only with the small enclaves around St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad. Post-Soviet Russia's only choice in the face of this new reality was to heavily fortify Kaliningrad and use it as the center of an anti-access area denial strategy through a buildup of aircraft, anti-ship missiles, and anti-aircraft missiles. Through these, Russia hoped to undermine NATO movements in the Baltic and threaten the commerce of its member states. In effect, Russia attempted to do to the Baltic what China has attempted to do to the South China Sea through its island-building campaign. Sweden's entry into NATO is a grave threat to this post-Soviet strategy. It has the largest coastline of any Baltic nation, allowing for free access to and from the North Sea, making it a maritime transit hub that's much more difficult for Russia to disrupt. Sweden's island of Gotland in particular is a strategic area. It's a key pivot point in the Baltic and only 250 kilometers north of Kaliningrad. This is the perfect area for a forward military base, one that can threaten Kaliningrad and carefully observe Russian activity in the area. It's impossible for Russia to send troops and supplies between St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad without transiting close to Gotland. In anticipation of its importance, Sweden is remilitarizing the island as part of its entry into NATO. It's only a matter of time before Stockholm equips it with A2AD assets of its own. Therefore, in any conflict, Kaliningrad will be surrounded and extremely difficult for Russia to reinforce and resupply. Additionally, Sweden's accession to NATO opens up alternative ways to reinforce the vulnerable Baltic states. The Suwalki Gap, the short border between Poland and Lithuania, which is sandwiched between Kaliningrad and Russia's vassal state of Belarus, has long been considered NATO's biggest geostrategic weakness. A pincer movement of Russian forces between these two lines could cut the Baltic states off from their NATO allies by land, while Russia overwhelms them with great numerical superiority over a short front. But with Sweden in the alliance, the Baltic states can now be reinforced through a direct sea route that Russia is in a poor position to dispute. Sweden joining the alliance makes the Baltic, for all practical purposes, a NATO lake. Russia is now surrounded by hostile coastlines in the Baltic Sea, making it practically impossible for it to transit its ships through the area. In any confrontation, NATO is in position to take control of the sea and cut off Russian trade while reinforcing hotspots as needed. Sweden not only brings geographical advantages at sea, but also on land. Its accession to NATO and the reunification of 2 centuries of military non-alignment also opens an unbroken land corridor between Norway and Finland. If either country were to be attacked along its respective borders with Russia, Sweden can act as a supply and troop transit hub for the other. Sweden's accession to NATO also comes with military advantages. Though often lampooned as being somehow effeminate and lacking vigor in its military affairs, Sweden is better prepared for conflict than many of its European neighbors. Although it does not currently meet its NATO benchmark of 2% of GDP on defense, spending only 1.3% in 2022, that number has steadily increased from a low of 1% in 2018. Stockholm plans to continue with this trend and accelerate it. In 2022, Sweden claimed that it aimed to reach the 2% mark by 2026. In September 2023, Sweden doubled down on this, with its defense ministry saying that it would already meet NATO's definition of the 2% mark in 2024, since the alliance's definition is broader and includes more items than appropriations. Nevertheless, on an official Defense Ministry document, Stockholm insisted it would not be stopping there. The government intends to continue proposing additional resources in the coming years so that the military defense appropriations will equate to 2% of GDP. Sweden also has an advanced military, despite its historically low level of spending. Among its useful assets is a fleet of 122 Stridsvagn tanks, an upgraded variant of the German Leopard 2. Sweden agreed to send 10 of its Stridsvagn tanks to Ukraine in February 2023. According to the Oryx blog, Ukraine has since lost 6 of these, but they demonstrated their worth in an incident from October, where a Russian anti-tank missile destroyed one of the Swedish tanks. However, the crew survived. Sweden thus brings additional tanks to NATO's land forces, ones which protect the lives of valuable tank crews from common anti-armor weapons. Aside from its tanks, Sweden has about 8,000 other vehicles and 26 self-propelled artillery systems, but it's lacking in MLRS systems and towed artillery, as it has none of them, according to the Global Firepower Index. Entry into NATO and an increase in its military budget should reduce this deficiency. In the skies, the Swedes command a fleet of about 30 Saab JAS-39 Gripen aircraft. These fourth-generation jet fighters come packed with the Beyond Visual Range Meteor air-to-air missile, which entered service in 2016. These projectiles have a range of about 150 kilometers with a no-escape zone of 60 kilometers. The no-escape zone is the area where there is a high probability of a kill even when the target is notified of the incoming threat. The Meteor's 60-kilometer range for this is the largest among the world's air-to-air missiles. The missile is, according to Saab, highly resistant to active and passive countermeasures like chaff, flares, and electronic warfare. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Ukraine has asked Sweden for Gripen fighter jets, and in August 2023 claimed that Ukrainian pilots were already training on them. In December, Ukraine and Sweden officially began dialogue on whether to donate some of the latter's Gripens to the Ukrainian Air Force. Sweden's entry into the alliance also offers the potential for its air force to get even stronger. Finland, for example, began its F-35 program in December 2021, when Helsinki selected the Lightning II to replace the FA-18 Hornets in its arsenal. Finland ordered 64 F-35 planes in a deal worth about $9.4 billion. As early as 2014, Sweden signed an agreement to train together with Finland and allow NATO assistance in a crisis. Now that both countries are part of NATO, it's possible and even likely that Sweden will get its own F-35 fleet in the near future, especially since more foreign countries are already opting for it over Sweden's capable Gripen in international arms deals. Sweden has also expressed interest in being part of the multinational effort to develop a sixth-generation fighter jet. It was once part of the Global Air Combat Program alongside the United Kingdom, Italy, and Japan, although it officially withdrew from the effort in November 2023. It remains to be seen if Sweden enters another effort to produce a sixth-generation fighter. That same month, Stockholm announced it would hold off on procuring a future fighter until 2031, after which it would assess risks and possibilities. What we do know is that Sweden is starting to think about a fighter to succeed the Gripen so that it can strengthen its air force against future threats. Either way, it will only get stronger over time thanks to the renewed commitments to its domestic defense and its seriousness about its role in NATO. But Sweden's most powerful addition to NATO's arsenal is not on land or in the skies, but on the seas. If Finland's entry provided an almost fatal check to Russian power on land, Sweden does the same on, and even maybe more importantly, under the seas. Although Sweden only has 5 submarines, 3 of them are of the advanced Gotland class. These submarines are powered by a novel method, the Stirling Air Independent Propulsion (AIP) system. Unlike most conventional submarines, the Gotland class uses liquid oxygen stored in onboard tanks to run diesel engines when the vessel's batteries need to be recharged. This means that they do not need to surface as part of this procedure, as a traditional diesel-electric sub must do. The AIP method not only comes with greater stealth, it also allows for deployment periods normally only seen with nuclear submarines, and indeed, consensus is that the Gotland-class submarine is the most advanced non-nuclear type ever built. Such long deployments are valuable assets for NATO, even in a defensive role. The Baltic is a narrow area with several natural choke points. Stationing Sweden's Gotland-class submarines in these choke points will enable their crews to listen in on and detect Russian submarines and other naval operations, increasing NATO's intelligence gathering capacity and its ability to defend vital infrastructure like gas pipelines and underwater communication cables, which Russian submarine crews are trained to find and disrupt or tap into. Sweden's submarines will also be able to stay there for weeks at a time, remaining on constant alert. Ironically, submarine operations in the Baltic have been a traditional weakness in NATO because with an average depth of only 60 meters, it's too shallow for nuclear-powered subs to operate in. And because the United States Navy's underwater vessels are all nuclear-powered, they have not been able to contribute to the security of the Baltic. The importance of this security is often overlooked, as the Baltic is one of the world's busiest shipping areas, accounting for roughly 15% of the world's maritime trade. Sweden's entry into NATO mitigates this security deficiency. The Baltic also has varying salinity levels due to the large amounts of rivers that feed it. This variation changes the buoyancy of a submarine and the amount of noise it makes. One must know these waters to stay silent. And because Sweden has been operating submarines in the Baltic since 1904, longer than any other country, it has institutional experience that no other state can match. Submarine Flotilla Commander Fredrik Linden perhaps best described the situation in an interview with Reuters. "We have expertise, which fills a gap, expertise that NATO doesn't have." 2 more submarines are scheduled for delivery in Sweden by 2028. This new type, called the A-26, will be able to launch remote-controlled or autonomous underwater drones to further increase intelligence collection and reduce risk to the crew. Sweden has a robust surface fleet too, with 35 fleet units in its active inventory as of 2024, according to the World Directory of Modern Military Warships. These ships are mostly light corvettes and offshore patrol vessels, but it will also bring 9 valuable mine warfare ships. At the very least, Sweden's entry into NATO adds to Russia's naval disadvantages in the Baltic. The Kremlin simply does not have the numbers or the firepower to compete with NATO's naval forces there, and it will not be able to do so anytime soon. NATO's combined navy has gotten much stronger with Sweden's membership, while the balance has tipped even more against Russia. For Putin, this is likely a big personal blow to his pride. Like many Russian rulers before him stretching back to Peter the Great, he has fancied his country as a sea power and has tried but failed to restore the Russian Navy's Soviet-era capabilities. Now Russia's access to the world's waterways is even further restricted, and it all came because of its latest dictator's own actions. But the Swedes don't intend to add to NATO only through air and sea power. Stockholm has every intention of doing so on land as much as it can. In that regard, the Swedes pledged to increase the size of their army by 30,000 personnel, with a 2025 timetable bringing the total up to 90,000. The 2024 budget includes investments in order to make this happen, such as increased appropriations for officer training. The new troops will be a welcome addition to the forward missions of NATO's multinational battle groups, which have been deployed in increased numbers to the countries bordering Ukraine since the start of the invasion. In the worst-case scenario, Sweden's bigger army will constitute a nearby reserve on an immediate call to help the beleaguered and outnumbered Baltic states. Sweden also has a reserve force of 32,900 personnel, plus 25,000 paramilitary troops. It has a total manpower reserve of 4.2 million. Overall, Sweden's military is ranked 29th in the 2024 list provided by the Global Firepower Index. In addition to its existing military technology and assets, Sweden has a robust arms industry despite its traditional neutrality. This gives the country a good foundation to actually carry through with its stated intentions on building a modern military. It's in a much better position to rearm than Germany, for example, whose frequent pledges to increase military spending have always fallen short. Sweden's arms industry will also be able to help other NATO members rearm adequately, and thanks to its strategic position, Sweden can serve as a convenient nearby hub to manufacture equipment and ammunition, which the war in Ukraine has shown gets depleted at a staggering rate in a peer or near-peer conflict. Russia's invasion of Ukraine deeply disturbed the nations of Europe. It was disturbing enough for Sweden to end over 200 years of military neutrality, which prevailed even during both world wars. In fact, the last time Sweden entered an armed conflict was in 1814 with the Swedish-Norwegian War. Thanks to Putin's decision to invade Ukraine, that has now changed, and Sweden is arming once again. Historically, Russia was Sweden's greatest enemy, and Putin clearly recalled unpleasant memories for the Swedes, no matter how deeply buried they were. Putin may have wanted to weaken the transatlantic alliance through an easy victory in Ukraine, but his failure to scare the world with the Russian military might only have made his geopolitical disadvantage worse. With Sweden's imminent entry, NATO is now stronger, and the vice around Russia in the Baltic is all but closed. Russia is now at its weakest position there since the Great Northern War in the early 18th century. The Swedes under Charles XII lost that conflict, and Russia soon became the preeminent power in the Baltic. Over 2 centuries later, it almost feels like the ghost of Charles XII is finally having the last laugh. Russia's current dictator Putin may walk away from his war with some territorial gains in Ukraine, but for him, was it worth the balance of power tipping even more in NATO's favor thanks to Sweden's entry into the alliance? He can pretend all he likes that none of this bothers him, but holed up in the Kremlin, he probably isn't too happy about this development, to say the least. Meanwhile, Sweden is in a military alliance with all the other Scandinavian states for the first time since the Kalmar Union in 1523. Putin's aggression united the Nordic countries in a way not seen in 5 centuries. So much for weakening and overawing the West. What do you think about Sweden's accession to NATO? In what other ways might it alter European geopolitics? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Now go and check out Why is Sweden preparing for war with Russia? Or click this other video instead. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. How is Ukraine adapting to the new realities on the battlefield as the war enters its 3rd year? One of the more important but understated ways is through the use of high-quality decoys to waste Russian drones and ammunition. But what exactly does this approach entail, and is it actually working? Let's dive in. When 2023 began, Western expectations for Ukraine were reaching a crescendo. Successful counteroffensives in Kherson and Kharkiv oblasts in the summer and fall of 2022 had revealed serious weaknesses in the Russian military. As Russia looked like it was exhausting itself trying to capture the minor city of Bakhmut, there were high hopes for a new offensive that would cut the invaders' land bridge to Crimea and deal a heavy military blow to the Russian war machine, while imperiling Vladimir Putin's political position at home. Unfortunately for Ukrainians, none of these hopes materialized. The offensive in Zaporizhia, which began in June, failed to even reach its initial objective at the city of Tokmak, despite the delivery of weapons the Ukrainians long desired, such as Western main battle tanks, cluster bombs, and long-range missiles such as the Franco-British Storm Shadow and American ATACMS. Russia, meanwhile, demonstrated renewed momentum, if slowly, and an ability to absorb punishment. Russia may not be in position to win the war as Putin would have liked when it began, but it's still not lost it. Now, as 2024 begins, the pendulum has swung the other way, and Western hopes for Ukraine are starting to ebb, which is one of the reasons why renewed military aid is becoming more and more controversial in the United States. As the prospects for victory look bleaker for Ukraine, the country is again being forced to turn to its wits to give it an extra edge, and to adapt to some of Russia's new methods of waging war. In comes the decoy strategy. Let's take a look at these decoys and why they have become such a necessity for both sides. The war in Ukraine has proven that drones have become one of the most important parts of the modern battlefield, confirming the results seen in the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia in 2020, when the former used them to completely reverse its traditional military disadvantage. In contrast, Russia paid comparatively little heed to drones when its war began. Its military doctrine heavily emphasizes artillery and tanks. Ukraine's use of drones quickly proved how vulnerable these traditional arms can be when they are improperly supported. Turkish Bayraktar TB2 drones made quick work of slow-moving Russian convoys around Kyiv. In April 2022, these drones reportedly played a role in the sinking of the cruiser Moskva, the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, by distracting the ship's air defense systems and providing targeting information for the Ukrainian Neptune missiles, which delivered the killing blows. Later, Ukraine proved the mettle of smaller, cheaper first-person view (FPV) drones controlled by an operator wearing a headset. These drones can provide surveillance and coordinates for artillery and act as loitering munitions in a kamikaze role. Ukraine has taken out many of Russia's armored assets using these devices, including some of the few BMP-T Terminator tanks that it has deployed in the war. Other innovative uses of drones included outfitting them with Cold War-era anti-tank grenades, guided by 3D-printed fins, or even converting old anti-aircraft guns into anti-personnel weapons with the assistance of drone targeting. However, as the Ukrainians invested in their drone forces, Russia gradually realized its vulnerability in this area, especially as it had fewer ballistic and cruise missiles to call upon in the wake of Western sanctions. To that end, Russia began investing heavily in purchases of Iranian Shahed 136 drones as 2022 went on. It was the start of a trend. As the war enters its 3rd year, Russia is gradually gaining superiority in drone warfare, and this has serious implications for some of Ukraine's most valuable military assets. Russia now reportedly produces between 330 and 350 Shahed drones on a monthly basis, according to Vadim Skibitsky, the second-in-command at Ukraine's defense intelligence. Russia is reported to have produced over 22,000 of them through 2023. The Shahed 136 is a loitering munition that entered service in 2021. It's relatively small, with a 3.5-meter length and 2.5-meter wingspan. It has a total weight of 200 kilograms and can carry a warhead between 36 and 50 kilograms in weight. Its range is between 1,000 and 2,500 kilometers, with a service ceiling of 4. Its main role is as an attack arm against stationary ground targets according to preset coordinates. It has no remote control. The drone is launched from a rack of 5. As the intensity of Russian missile bombardments began to wane, the Shahed 136 increasingly took to the skies. Between January and March 2023, near the height of Russia's attacks on Ukraine's civilian power grid, missiles of various types made up about 60% of the ammunitions, with Shahed drones making up the remaining 40%. Between April and June of 2023, the number reversed. Shahed drones made up 60% of air attacks, and missiles the remaining 40%. Although these drones are not nearly as fast or capable, they are much cheaper, and the arrival of the Shahed and other kamikaze loitering munitions on the battlefield heralds the coming of an era where the cost of precision strikes will be much lower than they were in the past. Russia is further adapting the Shahed 136. Toward the end of 2023, Ukraine was hit with waves of these devices that have stealth modifications to help them better infiltrate Ukrainian air defenses. Ukrainian officials downplayed these modified Shahed drones, claiming only that their new black color made them less visible to the naked eye. However, defense officials quietly admitted that this black material was at least partially radar absorbent. The material improves on the Shahed's stealthy design, where the body merges into the wing. This coating, likely founded on carbon-based stealth paint, makes these newer Shahed drones more difficult for Ukrainian radars to detect, especially when they are flying close to the ground, as they were designed to do. In addition to large Shahed drones, Russia has also geared up its procurement of smaller FPV drones. In May 2023, a Russian state-owned defense company announced that it will be making at least 3,000 FPV drones per month. Russia also began ramping up production of FPV drones through volunteer groups, which were capable of making thousands of drones per month as well. Ukraine once had an advantage in FPV drones, but that advantage started to dwindle throughout 2023. In November, Ukrainian FPV drone pilots fighting in Donetsk Oblast began claiming that Russia was now fielding them in greater numbers than their own side. Their drones are always in the air, day and night. We can see they've implemented serial production of drones for reconnaissance, surveillance, and for strikes, claimed a Ukrainian drone platoon commander in the area while speaking to Reuters under his codename Comrade. According to Comrade, the Russians now have twice the number of FPV drones as Ukraine's troops, at least in the Bakhmut area. Comrade was far from the only soldier saying this. Ukraine's forces began complaining about a lack of FPV drones as 2023 wound down. Another drone operator in the area, who went by the codename Yizak, said that it had now become a common occurrence to only have 2 or 3 drones to use against 10 identified targets. Russia's greater investment in FPV drones has exposed vulnerabilities in Ukrainian provision methods. While the Ukrainian government has funded the manufacture of larger, higher-flying, longer-range drones to conduct surveillance and priority assault missions, it has not done the same with the smaller, tactical-level FPV drones. Instead, the Ukrainian armed forces have procured these devices from civic organizations and the donations of private individuals. Often, Ukrainian soldiers themselves will pay for the drones. Russia's greatly increased drone capability means that it now has better surveillance than it did before the start of the war. Russia has increased its capabilities in other ways as well. Ammunition shortages have forced Russia to rely less on World War II-style saturation fire methods with its artillery. By the start of 2023, Russia had reduced its volume of artillery fire by 75% from the wartime high seen in the spring and summer of 2022. To compensate for the shortage, Russia got smarter about how to use its artillery. Instead of its usual methods, Russia has adapted to using Krasnopol laser-guided 152mm artillery shells to deliver more accurate strikes on Ukrainian artillery and defensive positions. According to a report by the Royal United Services Institute, by May 2023, the Russians were using their new shells in conjunction with Lancet loitering munitions to better target Ukrainian artillery and other important equipment. For the Ukrainians, adapting to these changes has proven challenging. In 2022, they were the masters of precision strikes with HIMARS and their superiority in drone warfare. While Russia's attacks were comparatively uncoordinated, that advantage waned significantly the following year and was one of the reasons why the offensive in Zaporizhia proved so disappointing for Ukraine and its Western allies. Russia's improved ability to conduct precision warfare, thanks to its emphasis on drones and its increased use of laser-guided artillery, has forced the Ukrainian armed forces to find adaptations of their own. One of the methods seems like it could come right out of World War II, when the Allies used dummy vehicles and artillery to confuse the Nazi war planners, especially in the build-up to the D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944. In September 2023, Ukrainian forces released footage of one of Russia's Shahed drones diving towards what looked like an air defense system. The drone barely missed its target, exploding in a large fireball a few meters away. However, even if the loitering munition had found its mark, it would have been in vain, because the supposed air defense system was a dummy. Ukraine's dummy equipment includes much more than air defense systems. A report for CNN also showed a dummy American towed howitzer made up of modified drain pipes. These are far from the only dummy weapons that Ukraine has put into service. Ukraine's HIMARS systems have long been a high-priority target for Russia. None of them have yet been damaged, however. This success comes partially because HIMARS is designed to be difficult to target because of its high mobility. Nevertheless, the Ukrainians are taking no chances. Kyiv has manufactured units of wooden, replica HIMARS. These decoys are then attached to wooden trucks and hang around near the front. The presence of these replicas serves to confuse the enemy and protect the real launchers. Ukraine was fielding these dummies as early as the summer of 2022, when precision HIMARS attacks on high-value Russian targets began to change the tempo of the war. Tanks are another arm which the Ukrainians have made decoys of. These decoys are often made of collapsible wood and extremely lifelike. Anton Geroshenko, an advisor to the Ukrainian government, said in an interview with The Economist that one would not be able to tell that these devices are dummies even from a distance of 5 meters. Ukraine has also taken a page right out of the playbook of the D-Day preparations. Part of those preparations included creating a fake army with inflatable equipment, codenamed Operation Fortitude. Wood replicas work, but they come at the cost of being heavy and harder to maintain. Vehicles are needed to transport them, and a lot of valuable labor time is spent assembling and disassembling them. By contrast, inflatable decoys are cheaper and can sometimes be carried by a single man, allowing them to deploy much more rapidly. However, these dummy vehicles are also far more sophisticated than their World War II-era ancestors. One of Ukraine's suppliers for its inflatable dummies, a Czech company called Inflatech, uses flexible reflectors which simulate the heat of a gun that has just fired its projectile. These dummies are even capable of producing radar signatures. The products seem to be working, because Inflatech has seen its business increase by 30% since the start of the Russian invasion. Inflatech's offerings include 30 different products, ranging from tanks, armored vehicles, aircraft, artillery, and large weapons. They are typically made from light materials such as artificial silk, which will keep their weight low. 100-kilogram weights are common for its products. The decoys are usually operated by a team of 4 soldiers and can be unwrapped or inflated within 10 minutes. Tanks are far from the only devices which can be simulated with inflatables. Artillery, mortars, and even machine guns are capable of being replicated in this way. One of the biggest values of the dummy weapons comes in their cost to manufacture, compared against their cost to destroy. To illustrate, Iranian Shahed drones are extremely cost-effective. They typically cost between $20,000 and $50,000 apiece. By October 2022, it had cost Ukraine more to shoot down the drones than it had cost Russia to launch them. Russia spent a range of $11.6 to $17.9 million on these operations. Ukraine spent about $28 million countering them. Russia's increased use of drones since then adds to the financial pressure. The CNN report pointed out that a real towed howitzer could cost $2 million to $4 million apiece. Tanks can cost even more. A modern Abrams tank can cost up to $10 million. A Leopard can cost $6 million and a Challenger can cost about $5 million. A HIMARS system costs about $5 million apiece. Meanwhile, each GMLRS rocket that can be loaded into HIMARS can cost $100,000 apiece. ATACMS missiles, which are also loaded into HIMARS, can cost $1.3 to $1.7 million each, depending on the range and guidance system. There are many other expensive pieces of equipment that are high-priority targets for Russia's much cheaper drone forces. The dummy howitzer, on the other hand, costs only $1,000, which puts the overall math into perspective. The inflatable dummies from Inflatech can be much more expensive. The products the company makes for training purposes can cost $100,000 apiece. This is more expensive than many of Russia's drones, but even if these are destroyed, they are much more expendable than losing a real tank, artillery piece, or air defense system. and the decoys have proven effective in their purpose of depleting Russian ammunition. As early as the summer of 2022, before Russia started to ramp up its drone capabilities, Ukraine was deploying the wooden replica HIMARS systems. That summer, Defense Minister Shoigu personally ordered Ukraine's HIMARS units to be a priority after they had demonstrated their effectiveness against critical Russian military infrastructure. Moscow has repeatedly bragged about destroying these systems. At one point, Shoigu and other Russian commanders announced that a new successful strike had been conducted on HIMARS or other Western rocket artillery systems almost on a weekly basis. An American diplomat commented in a Washington Post report from that time about Russia's braggadocio. They've claimed to have hit more HIMARS than we've even sent. Although Russia has long had a history of inflating its combat performance, the Post noted that the Ukrainian decoys probably accounts for some of the confusion. George Barros, a military researcher at the Institute for the Study of War, commented, "If the Russians think they hit a HIMARS, they will claim they hit a HIMARS. Russian forces very well may be overstating their battle damage assessments after hitting HIMARS decoys." In the first year of the war, these decoys proved particularly effective at degrading Russian combat effectiveness. Russia was using its missiles far more frequently in those days, and according to Ukrainian officials, the Russian armed forces had indeed wasted expensive Caliber cruise missiles on the dummies. Each expensive missile used on a fake HIMARS represented a massive drain on resources for the Russian war machine. It's an excellent example of the asymmetric warfare that Ukraine has needed to practice against its larger enemy. Ukraine has other options to make HIMARS decoys too. Inflatech specializes in making reproductions of Soviet-era equipment. However, it has since put inflatable HIMARS replicas into its product line. This might be one of the reasons why the company's CEO, Wojtek Fresser, expects to see double-digit growth for the next 3 to 5 years. In the summer of 2022, the company produced about 50 decoys a month. NATO countries are its typical customer, and Fresser did not confirm that his company's products had made their way to Ukraine, but he did say that he could imagine sending an imperiled partner country inflatable decoys. Russia has since been more selective in the way that it deploys its missiles, but the decoys are equally effective against drones. The Shahed or Russian-manufactured Lancet drones, despite being comparatively cheap, are much more expensive than many of the Ukrainian decoys, turning the attritional maths against the invader. The use of decoys against cheaper FPV drones is also effective. Although the costs are not as lopsided in this way, the Ukrainians have used decoys as more than cost sinks for their enemy. Decoys confuse surveillance drones and provide false targeting information to Russian artillery, getting them to waste valuable shells and rockets. Decoys also serve in their age-old role of confusing the enemy as to Ukrainian intentions. Russian FPV drones might detect artillery seemingly stationed to fire on a certain position, leaving other positions vulnerable to the real attack. Russia hasn't neglected dummies either, and Moscow has been putting these kinds of decoys into practice for a long time prior to the war in Ukraine. In September 2023, a drone captured video circulating on social media, purportedly by Ukraine's 116th Mechanized Brigade, showed inflatable Russian T-72 tanks. The brigade warned Ukraine's armed forces to be careful about how they use their ammunition in response to these decoys. Russian forces have also been known to use dummies of fighter jets like the MiG-31 and the S-300 missile system. The Russians have used more extensive decoys as well, creating simulated radar stations. New technology has made decoys a much more expensive acquisition than that seen in the past. No World War II-style decoy would fool modern surveillance systems. High-resolution infrared and thermal imaging can easily spot fakes. As we mentioned before, modern decoys manufactured by companies like Inflatech mitigate some of these disadvantages, but as surveillance of the battlefield becomes easier thanks to ubiquitous drones, both sides in the war are trying to improve their decoys, creating a new type of arms race. In the T-72 example given previously, the Russians attempted to conceal 2 of the dummies with camouflage materials and some foliage, but because Russia left them out in the open, they were easy to spot as fakes. High-resolution imagery revealed that they were obviously inflated devices, with smooth sides and corners. Even an untrained eye would be able to spot the difference between a real T-72 and the fake seen in these images. One Ukrainian company producing decoy artillery said that in order to trick modern surveillance methods, decoys needed to be covered in nets and surrounded by dugout trenches to produce more of an impression that they are the real devices. Leaving inflated equipment out in the open was insufficient. As 2024 ramps up, both Ukraine and Russia will continue to improve their drone warfare capabilities. With these improvements, both sides will become more adept at finding targets of opportunity. Anti-drone weapons and tactics will see increased development in the long term, but in the short term, expect both sides to use new and improved decoys to try to confuse and deplete the other's ammunition. What improvements do you think will be made to decoy technology? How will both sides continue to adapt to the other's increased ability to conduct low-cost precision strikes? Don't forget to let us know in the comments, and make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. In January 2024, NATO kicked off Steadfast Defender 2024, an exercise so massive it's been dubbed the biggest military shuffle since the legendary Cold War Reforger maneuvers of 1988. This isn't just any routine drill, it's a historical behemoth marking NATO's grandest display in the post-Cold War era. With new members on board and tensions in Europe simmering, this exercise has all the ingredients of a high-stakes military drama. For the first time, Sweden flexed its muscles alongside NATO powers as a fully fledged member, expanding the scope and intensity of the alliance's maneuvers. But as you might guess, not everyone's throwing a party over this. Putin has been eyeing these developments with more than a little unease. In today's video, we're diving deep into Steadfast Defender 2024. We'll break down the nuts and bolts of the exercises, explore Russia's chilly reception, and unpack the strategic moves that have led NATO to ramp up its game. Buckle up, it's going to be an intriguing ride through modern military history. Let's get started with a quick overview. Steadfast Defender began on January 22nd and will end on May 31st. It involves all 32 NATO countries, including Sweden, which formally joined the alliance as the operation was underway. 90,000 troops will take part in this drill, which will span the entirety of NATO's territory from North America to the Russian border. General Christopher Cavoli, NATO's Supreme Allied Commander Europe, stated that Steadfast Defender would be a demonstration of the alliance's ability to reinforce the entire Euro-Atlantic area, including through transatlantic movements of forces to counter the threat of a near-peer adversary. In other words, this exercise would simulate a combined response to a Russian attack on a NATO country, almost certainly in Eastern Europe. Poland, the Baltic, Germany, Norway, and Romania are therefore major areas for the exercise's operations, as all of these places are considered vulnerable to a Russian attack. In outlining the overall goal of the operation, Cavoli stated, "Exercise Steadfast Defender 2024 will be a clear demonstration of our unity, our strength, and our determination to protect each other, to protect our values and the rules-based international order." American units participating in the Steadfast Defender exercise include the US Second Fleet, Green Berets, and Marines. According to the US Department of Defense, over 50 total naval assets are taking part in Steadfast Defender, along with more than 1,100 combat vehicles. These vehicles include over 150 tanks, 500 infantry fighting vehicles, and 400 armored personnel carriers. Aircraft included are F-35s, FA-18s, F-15s, and Harrier jets and helicopters. 20,000 troops from the United Kingdom are also among the participants. 16,000 of these are from the British Army, with much of the activity coming from the 7th Light Mechanized Brigade Combat Team, which has taken its tanks, artillery, and helicopters with it. Other British Army units in Steadfast Defender 2024 include the Commando Helicopter Force, 16th Air Assault Brigade, and 16th Armored Brigade Combat Team. 2,000 sailors and 400 Royal Marines from the Royal Navy are participating as well. A British carrier strike group centered on one of the two Queen Elizabeth-class aircraft carriers and its assortment of F-35B fighters is taking part in exercises in the North Atlantic, North Sea, and the Baltic. 15,000 of the troops in Steadfast Defender are from Poland, 10,000 are from Germany, an additional 5,000 are Dutch. The Steadfast Defender exercises are meant to be the first large-scale test of NATO's new defense plans that were approved at the Alliance's summit in Vilnius this year. According to NATO, Steadfast Defender 2024 is based on a fictitious Article 5 scenario triggered by a fictitious attack against the Alliance launched by a near-peer adversary. The Alliance's official website has detailed a timeline that offers an overview of all the sub-exercises in Steadfast Defender and their purposes. According to NATO, the first part of Steadfast Defender is focused on securing the Atlantic up to the Arctic. Live maritime exercises and amphibious assault drills are a big focus for this phase. The second part of Steadfast Defender is focused on moving troops through Europe. Troops and equipment will be deployed rapidly across national borders as part of this phase. The exercise began on January 22nd in Norfolk, Virginia. That city hosts NATO's Joint Command Force Norfolk, which is coordinating the first phase. American forces would be departing from there on that date, while Canadian forces would set off from Nova Scotia soon afterward. Between February 11th and 20th, NATO conducted maritime live exercises to test its ability to secure lines of reinforcement and communication across the Atlantic. According to the alliance, these drills, called MARCOM LIVEX, were conducted primarily off the Spanish coast. The next set of exercises, called Brilliant Jump, took place between February 12th and 28th. These tested the NATO response force's ability to plan and execute rapid deployments, including standby readiness during peacetime. These exercises were based in Germany and Poland. Then came Joint Warrior, led by the United Kingdom, where it primarily took place between February 24th and March 3rd. These drills emphasized maritime and offshore maneuvers in conjunction with air and land operations. Exercise Dragon 24 came between February 25th and March 14th. This one was led by Poland as part of a unilateral effort to train all branches of its armed forces to respond to crises. About 20,000 total troops from 10 NATO countries participated in Dragon 24. All of the 15,000 Polish troops in Steadfast Defender took part in the exercise. Sabre Strike 24 just started in April 2024 and is being led by US Army Europe and Africa. This set of exercises is also part of Part 2 and takes place from April 8th to 30th in Germany, Poland, and Lithuania, and it's putting emphasis on rapid deployment and cold weather training in the Baltic area. From February 29th to March 14th, NATO troops participated in Trojan Footprint 24, a drill that focused on improving the integration and interoperability of member states' respective special operations forces. Bulgaria, Georgia, Germany, Greece, North Macedonia, and Romania were the main host countries for this drill. About 2,000 special operations troops from Albania, Bulgaria, France, Georgia, Greece, Italy, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Portugal, Romania, Spain, the United Kingdom, and the United States participated in the exercise. The United States contributed about 900 of those troops. The Green Berets were known to participate in airborne operations alongside Greek paratroopers as part of the exercise. The Trojan Footprint exercise has occurred annually since 2002. The Crystal Arrow set of exercises took place between March 4th and 15th. Latvia was the host country for these drills, and the Latvian Mechanized Infantry Brigade led them. The purpose was to practice alert procedures and evaluate the readiness of NATO's multinational battle group Latvia. The Nordic response drills occurred between March 3rd and 14th. As the name implies, the purpose of this drill was to increase NATO's ability to address challenges in the extreme north. Finland and Sweden's entry into the alliance expanded these exercises. This drill involved over 20,000 troops, 50 ships, and 110 aircraft from 14 NATO countries. The next on NATO's list is Defender 24, scheduled for the span of April 8th to May 31st, and organized by the United States European Command. This exercise involves deployment of forces over distances stretching from North America to US EUCOM's area of responsibility, with Northern Europe as the primary focus point. Defender 24 tests NATO's ability to receive, stage, and deploy these forces in Europe. Defender 24 is the foundation for other exercises like Sabre Strike 24, Immediate Response 24, and Swift Response 24. Immediate response will occur between April 21st and May 31st. The United States will lead this exercise that's designed to boost the interoperability of NATO countries. The Hungarians will lead the Brave Warrior exercises between May 1st and 22nd and will include all forces in NATO's multinational battle group Hungary. Its purpose is to increase the training for this battle group to lead international operations and plan and conduct defensive operations. Spring Storm will take place in Estonia between May 12th and 31st. It's that country's largest annual military drill and will be led by one of the Estonian Defense Forces infantry divisions. It will focus on joint defensive operations with other NATO units. The aforementioned Swift Response 24 will occur between May 14th and June 14th, therefore going over the time technically allotted to the broader Steadfast Defender exercise. The United States will lead this drill and focus on joint airborne operations. Poland, the Baltic states, and Georgia will be the primary staging grounds. Finally, there is the German-led Grand Quadriga exercise, set to take place between April 30th and July 30th, running well over the allotted time for Steadfast Defender. Germany and Lithuania will be the primary staging grounds. The Grand Quadriga drills will focus on deterrence and NATO's defense posture. Taken together, we see that the Steadfast Defender 2024 exercise will simulate multiple types of combat across the entirety of NATO's territory, implying that it will test the alliance's ability to fight a war across a broad front resembling the World Wars. Though NATO made carefully worded statements to stress that Steadfast Defender was not directed against any country, Russia is the only one that fits the bill of being able to create the scenario the alliance was training to counter. A NATO official, quoted by the US Department of Defense, admitted that the alliance was closely watching the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and incorporating its lessons into plans to improve training, capabilities, and innovation. Policymakers in Moscow were not fooled either. Before the exercises began, Russia's foreign ministry claimed that NATO was conducting a demonstration of force on Russia's doorstep. Russia's deputy foreign minister, Alexander Grushko, called Steadfast Defender the irrevocable return of the alliance to Cold War hostility. Another spokesman for the Russian government, Dmitry Peskov, said that the exercises were quite unprecedented and that NATO was making no attempt to hide the fact that they were aimed against Russia. On February 5th, former Russian President and Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev warned on social media that there was a potential for a big war with NATO, and said that Steadfast Defender 2024 came as a result of Western politicians who have shit their pants. Their mediocre NATO generals have once again decided to scare us. Medvedev insisted that Russia would never strike first against a NATO country, but that it would be prepared to respond to an attack against its own integrity or increased NATO association with Ukraine. Not coincidentally, Vladimir Putin himself traveled to Kaliningrad shortly after Steadfast Defender began. According to the Institute for the Study of War, the Russians have done more than complain about Steadfast Defender. They have tried to undermine it. On January 20th, before the exercises began, the ISW accused Russia of conducting an information operation to misrepresent the NATO exercise. According to the ISW, the Kremlin's information operation against Steadfast Defender came in several dimensions. Firstly, it tried to portray the drills as a provocation on the part of NATO. This cannot be the truth because the exercise is based on a simulated Article 5 scenario. Article 5 in the North Atlantic Treaty is by law defensive in nature. The parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all, and consequently they agree that, if such an armed attack occurs, each of them, in exercise of the right of individual or collective self-defense recognized by Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations, will assist the party or parties so attacked by taking forthwith, individually and in concert with the other parties, such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area. The North Atlantic Treaty, therefore, establishes that NATO is a defensive alliance. It does not cover the scenarios of a member provoking or aggressing against another country. Article 5 cannot be invoked for such purposes. The Steadfast Defender exercise also came in direct response against Russia's increasing provocations, not only against Ukraine, but against former members of the alliance. A case in point can be found in leaked Kremlin documents that were composed in the fall of 2021 by Russia's Directorate for Interregional Relations and Cultural Contacts. These documents were leaked to Swedish media in May 2023. They revealed that Russia would attempt to increase its influence over the Baltic states and reduce NATO's presence there between 2022 and 2030. In the short term, Russia sought to create new centers of influence, like NGOs, to promote closer cooperation between the Baltic states and itself, and preserve historical memory by stopping the demolition of Soviet-era monuments. NATO and its relations with the Baltic states is a key area of focus for the Kremlin. Stopping NATO's plans to build a permanent base in Lithuania by 2030, the militarization of Lithuanian territory, as the relevant document called it, is one of the plan's primary concerns. By 2030, Russia also aims to get the Baltic states to reverse course in their opinion on NATO. Through opinion-shaping operations, the Kremlin aims for the Baltic states to come to view NATO's expansion into Eastern Europe as potentially damaging to their national security. As such, Russia wants to stop their increasing cooperation with NATO's forward presence in Eastern Europe and gradually restore ties with these former Soviet states, including military ties. Russia plans to foster pro-Moscow politicians in the Baltic states and take advantage of the presence of the sizable ethnic Russian minorities in Estonia and Latvia. Although the documents outline plans for Russia to use soft power methods like the promotion of cultural ties and increase of cross-border investments, Moscow plans to use harder methods too. One of these is to stop the Baltic states from leaving the treaty that synchronizes their electric grids into a shared network with Russia and Belarus. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are in the process of integrating their power grids with Europe. The Baltic states plan to complete this process after a test at the end of 2025, and from that point forward, abandon the shared grid with Russia and Belarus. The Russian documents identified this plan as a threat. These documents are similar to the ones Russia drafted concerning Belarus, which some believe is an annexation plan. It is likely that the officials who wrote these documents did not know that Putin had plans to invade Ukraine, as there were no such hints, and many of their theories seem much more outlandish now than even in 2021. Nevertheless, the documents outlined Russia's general attitude of disrespect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states that had once been within the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire. Tellingly, Russia explicitly mentioned the Baltic states when responding to the NATO drills. According to the Kremlin, the alliance was using the Steadfast Defender exercise to wind up and provoke the Baltic states into a war with Russia. This is the attitude that NATO's Steadfast Defender exercises were designed in response to. It's not a coincidence that these exercises came after the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the revelation of these sorts of plans. Russia's rhetorical attempt to shift the narrative to NATO being the aggressor is not only a bid to escape scrutiny for its aggressive actions, it can also be seen as a way to shape the information environment for future moves against the Baltic states, as Moscow may claim that it's responding to a potential attack. In general, Putin has identified and viewed the Western powers as his and Russia's enemy, and his response to Steadfast Defender was not the first time he has attempted to create this information environment. He has repeatedly claimed that he is fighting in Ukraine because of Western aggression and threats against Russia. According to the ISW, recent Russian electronic warfare exercises in Kaliningrad may have also been more of a grey zone operation than a strict exercise. These exercises took place between December 25th and 27th, 2023, and again between January 10th and 16th, 2024. The Russian exercises reportedly caused unprecedentedly high GPS jamming in northern and central Poland, as well as in the southern Baltic area. It's in this context that NATO decided to conduct the largest exercise since the Cold War. While Steadfast Defender has gone smoothly so far, the exercise comes at a time of peril for the alliance. Russia is gaining momentum in Ukraine, albeit at a high price. The Russian military has suffered enormously, but has adapted to developments on the battlefield, including with the use of drones. NATO countries have also shown vulnerability. On the day before Steadfast Defender began, the alliance reported that it would miss its overall target for spending 2% of GDP on defense, as most of the members would not hit that mark. While NATO members have increased their defense spending since 2014 and pledged to greatly increase military expenditures following the invasion of Ukraine, only 11 of the 32 members of the alliance spent at least 2% in 2023. More are expected to reach the goal this year, including Montenegro, North Macedonia, Denmark, and the newest NATO member, Sweden. However, Western European countries continue to fall short of the target, testing America's patience in the process. During a bitterly partisan presidential election, experts warn that Western Europe is running out of time to get its act together. While President Biden has been more patient, he is deeply unpopular at home, and both of his immediate predecessors were far more critical of NATO countries being free riders. There is no guarantee that his successor, whoever it is, will be as patient as he is. Furthermore, Russia has been more resilient in the face of sanctions than many in the West had hoped for. Russia's economy survived the temporary shock and has transitioned to a war footing. Russia has kept pace with productions of tanks, vehicles, missiles, and other pieces of military hardware. Meanwhile, many NATO allies have low stockpiles of ammunition, which have been further stressed in supplying Ukraine. This reality has caused officials from Germany, Belgium, and Sweden to warn that NATO allies have a short window to prepare for a potential war with Russia. Admiral Rob Bauer of the Netherlands, the chairman of NATO's military committee, warned that the West has grown too accustomed to peace and needs to be more prepared for conflict, which will involve the whole of society, whether we like it or not. This reveals the purpose of Steadfast Defender 2024. NATO allies are working together in a series of maneuvers of unprecedented size to prepare for a potential war, and Russia's conduct toward NATO's members and the alliance as a whole has only reinforced the need for preparedness. The results of Steadfast Defender will undoubtedly be discussed and analyzed at the 2024 NATO summit to be held in Washington between July 9th and 11th. These results will likely be the foundation for future exercises and a general transition of the alliance toward a state of further readiness for conflict. Overall, Steadfast Defender is a sign of the times. NATO officials have warned that Western countries had become complacent in the belief that history had ended in 1991. That was not the case, and now the alliance must relearn the skills and acquire a state of readiness that had been allowed to atrophy. Do you think Steadfast Defender exercises will assist NATO in its preparedness? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Putin is terrified of F-16s in Ukraine, and he should be. Since basically the beginning of the Russian invasion, Ukraine has been pleading with its Western supporters for advanced fighter jets. For most of the war, the US has been staunchly opposed to giving Ukraine these systems, as they could allow for strikes far behind Russian lines, escalating the conflict. But now officials in Kyiv might be finally getting their wish, in the form of US-made F-16s set to be delivered later this year. As of this video, the training for Ukrainian F-16 pilots has begun in Denmark, and is set to begin in multiple other NATO countries such as the Netherlands. Back at the annual G7 summit in May, with Ukraine's Zelensky as a special guest, US President Joe Biden announced that the US would conduct its own training for Ukrainian F-16 pilots, which it estimated could be completed in under a year, with basic training possibly taking only 4 months. But where might all these jets be coming from? How important are they to Ukraine? And perhaps most importantly, how could they change the outcome of this brutal and unpredictable war? Let's start with the question of where exactly the F-16s might be coming from. There are more than 2,200 F-16s around the world, making it the most popular combat aircraft in use today. But the most likely candidates seem to be jets recently retired by the Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway. These would likely be the F-16 AM/BM models, which were originally acquired in the 1980s and upgraded in the 1990s. All of these would therefore be aging aircraft with high mileage and old radar systems. But even with these drawbacks, the jet's software allows them to use some of the most modern and deadly weapons in the NATO arsenal, including the AIM-120 air-to-air missiles and stealthy long-range joint air-to-surface standoff missiles, or JASSMs. Reports suggest that the Netherlands in particular was closely involved in the effort to get Washington to approve the F-16 training, helping convince Biden of their need in Ukraine. Interestingly, however, the F-16s aren't coming from the US at all. This is probably partially due to the tensions with China, for which the Pentagon is keeping significant material in reserve in case an air or naval battle breaks out over the Taiwan Strait or South China Sea. The other main reason is that US policymakers still worry that too aggressive or successful a strike by Ukraine could force Putin's hand in ways we'd all rather not think about. That was the rationale behind the strategy so far: give Ukraine as many surface-to-air and land capabilities as possible, while avoiding the potential of an aerial strike inside Russian territory. But this logic has already been challenged by Ukraine's use of drones in so-called shaping operations in recent weeks, some of which have reached as far as Moscow. Because of this, the authorization for Ukraine to receive F-16s and the associated training has been a matter of tension in Washington for months. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and several others have objected to the idea, essentially claiming that there were too many unknowns and that Ukraine has done well enough without F-16s. So the approval for other countries to ship their F-16s to Ukraine is still a big change, overriding a key condition baked into their initial sale by the US, which prohibited European allies from sending them elsewhere. Secretary of State Antony Blinken was apparently one of the driving forces behind the administration's decision, as well as helping to convince European NATO allies to get on board. Yet even so, it's unclear when any of these countries will actually be supplying the F-16s in question. The Netherlands, Belgium, and Denmark are working towards replacing their current F-16s with more advanced F-35s, but have all held back on actually committing to sending the old jets to Ukraine. Similarly, the UK has offered to provide flight training, but doesn't actually operate any F-16s itself. While this may start to change once the training is complete, there's currently a lot of hesitation from the West about pushing Putin just a little too far and ending up in some sort of nuclear standoff. Some countries like Belgium also worry about diminishing their own capabilities. Not that Belgium is a likely candidate to be invaded by anyone. Others, like Denmark, have stated that they will reconsider sending F-16s if others are also doing so, but that they won't go it alone. The Netherlands and Norway appear to be similarly torn, while other countries with F-16s not in the process of being phased out are much less likely to join in. In a nutshell, at the moment it's pretty clear that even those countries which have declared support for Ukraine's push for jets either can't or aren't willing to provide significant numbers of them in the short to medium term. Once Ukraine actually gets the aircraft, there's another set of problems it needs to deal with. Specifically, they must be able to operate, maintain, and sustain the F-16s, which is not the easiest task. For instance, a March 2023 study by the Congressional Research Service identified several crucial conditions necessary to successfully field the jets. The biggest concerns it identified concern the supply chain. This means acquiring sufficient spare parts, allocating funding for operations and support, implementing a maintenance inventory system, training maintainers, and acquiring an ongoing supply of weapons with which to arm their F-16s. These tasks are difficult enough for countries in peacetime, with previous experience and a wide base of technical knowledge. For Ukraine, they are likely to be even trickier. Of course, if the course of the war so far is anything to judge by, Ukrainians will continue to figure out inventive solutions to logistical issues facing their military. Russians, on the other hand, have no hope of obtaining advanced fighter jets and are stuck using obsolete human wave tactics while trying to avoid kicking off a civil war in their own country. But even accounting for the staggering incompetence of the Russian military, Ukraine certainly still faces some hurdles obtaining and operating even used F-16s. If they take to the skies without plans to support these aircraft, they will break down quickly and most likely become expensive stationary targets for Russian air-to-surface missiles. This is especially true for the F-16, which can require some 18 hours of maintenance for every hour of flight time. Basically, if they do things right and don't rush it, there's a strong possibility that Ukraine won't even be using the F-16s until the end of 2023. This also suggests that many defense experts believe the war will continue for quite some time, despite the incompetence of the Russian armed forces and short mutiny of the Wagner Group PMC. By greenlighting the transfer of the F-16s, the US is essentially admitting that the war will not stop anytime soon, and that Ukraine will need continual upgrades to its firepower in a long-term war of attrition. If Ukraine can get a handle on the jet's supply and maintenance, that's when the training will really start to become important. Like any complex weapon system, the F-16 was designed to fill a particular set of roles in an existing military structure and support certain doctrines of modern warfare. To get the most out of them, the Ukrainians will need to adopt more of the practices and techniques which the plane's design caters to. Fundamentally, the F-16 was designed to help the US Air Force beat the Russian Air Force in aerial combat. Logic follows that the more the Ukrainians can fly them like the US Air Force would, the better the results will be. Of course, other NATO countries have adopted similar practices, but most of these are also quite different from the ways Ukraine has been fielding their existing fighter jets. For one thing, the F-16 was essentially designed to be a lightweight, multi-role fighter capable of doing many different missions well, but not to be the best at any of them. F-16s were definitely not intended to be operated from improvised airfields as Ukraine has been doing with many of its current aircraft. They can be especially susceptible to getting debris caught in their engines, a great way to crash before ever engaging in combat. This brings up the issue of where Ukraine would put the 200 F-16s it's asking for. Rand Corporation analysts John Hone and William Courtney recently assessed that F-16s do best on long, pristine runways. They could face difficulties on the rougher, former Soviet ones dispersed across Ukraine. To bring in Western aircraft, Ukraine might need to repave and potentially extend a number of runways, a process which Russia would likely detect. If only a few airfields were suitable and in known locations, focused Russian attacks could impede Ukrainian F-16s from flying. This is mostly because, idiotic and unprepared as most of Russia's military might be, they still have access to some pretty advanced technology. This is especially true when it comes to air-to-air combat. Modern Russian air fighters such as the MiG-31 and Su-35 can see quite far with their powerful modern radars. They also have R-37 missiles that have a longer range than NATO-supplied AIM-120 AMRAAMs, or advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles. In other words, Russian aircraft can potentially spot Ukrainian F-16s and shoot them down before the Ukrainian pilots see them coming. Some of this has already happened with Ukraine's current fleet of Su-27 and MiG-29 fighters, and the improved capabilities of the F-16 are not enough to change this dynamic. Because of the reach of these Russian fighters, Ukrainian fighter pilots often break off missions early or operate far behind their own front lines. F-16s would operate with the same constraints, limiting their ability to perform air-to-surface missions with relatively short-range weapons like the JDAM bomb guidance kits. Because of this, even once Ukraine receives F-16s, it will still most likely have to rely on drones and other current air platforms for support. There's also the question of how to get the proper armaments Ukraine needs to pair with the F-16s. The best way for Ukraine to capitalize on any F-16s it receives will be advanced Western armaments which can stand up to Russian firepower. The issue, like everything else in a war, these can be staggeringly expensive. For instance, a single AMRAAM costs about $1.2 million, while it takes about 2 years to make one. The US could always provide existing weapons like the AMRAAM from its own stockpiles, but that could leave them depleted in the event of an unexpected conflict, a risk the Pentagon is not willing to take. However, the real tactical and logistical advantages that F-16s would provide to Ukraine are long-term. A major benefit is that it will be easier for Ukraine to maintain aircraft whose parts are supplied by the United States and NATO than their current, outdated aircraft manufactured by Russia. In turn, this could also make it easier for Ukraine to integrate their air force into NATO sometime in the future. And the more Ukraine's arsenal is compatible with NATO's, the better they'll fare, and the worse off Putin will find himself. For instance, Ukraine was previously given AGM-88 high-speed anti-radiation missiles, HARM, to use against ground-based radar systems. As with much of their current military arsenal, they managed to attach the system onto their MiG-29s, but the end result was far from ideal, since Soviet-era fighters were not designed to fire US-manufactured missiles. F-16s with modern software will enable Ukraine to employ HARMs and other modern weapon systems much more effectively. This includes missiles such as the AIM-9 Sidewinder and the AIM-120, which the United States and NATO are likely to provide, will be useful for Ukraine's defense against Russian cruise missiles like the Kh-101 and the Kh-555, and against Iranian-made Shahed kamikaze drones. Ukraine's stockpiles of Soviet S-300 surface-to-air missiles are running out pretty quickly, and there are only so many Patriot missiles available. So even if Russia will still have some superior jets, the F-16's air-to-air capability will definitely help those ground-based defenses last longer, and it's pretty clear that this is necessary. Western military analysts have estimated that Ukraine's combined fleet belonging to air and ground forces has been depleted by more than a third since the Russian invasion began. Ukraine has lost at least 60 of its 145 fixed-wing planes and 32 of 139 helicopters, according to classified US military information leaked on the social media platform Discord in recent months. The Ukrainian Air Force rarely reveals numbers regarding its fleet or other details of tactical importance, including incidents of planes shot down or otherwise destroyed, but officials have acknowledged losses from the more than a year of war, as well as difficulties with the repair and replacement of damaged planes. Another big question is whether the United States will supply powerful JASSMs to use with the F-16s. These deadly, low-detection cruise missiles are incredibly long-range and have a 1,000-pound armor-piercing warhead. It also seems there's a good chance of this happening. Britain has provided the Storm Shadow air-launched cruise missiles, and Ukraine has already put them to use. Storm Shadow is generally similar to the baseline version of JASSM in terms of size, range, employment, and observability, so providing JASSMs would not necessarily be an escalation. F-16s utilizing JASSMs could allow for Ukrainian Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov's stated long-term plan to retake Crimea without a fight. Carrying out such a plan would require cutting off Russian troops in Crimea from their supply lines via the Kerch Strait Bridge, ports like Sevastopol, and the land route from the Russian city of Rostov-on-Don. JASSMs could give Ukraine the ability to fire on and destroy logistic hubs like naval bases, ammunition depots, bridges, and command and control facilities deep within Crimea. It could also serve as an alternative to the surface-to-air ATACMS missile, which Ukraine has requested but not yet received. The United States has quite a few more JASSMs than ATACMS, so it might be willing to supply them to augment Ukraine's current arsenal of Storm Shadows. Another area F-16s could be helpful to Ukraine is as a good old-fashioned deterrent. While Putin clearly has no desire for the war to end, he was recently forced to replace General Sergei Surovikin due to his involvement in the Wagner Group's attempted coup against Putin himself. Surovikin was widely known as one of Russia's most trigger-happy commanders, willing to launch indiscriminate attacks against the civilian population of Ukraine. But whoever he gets replaced with may be less gung-ho about ordering air and drone strikes on Kyiv, especially if Ukraine has 200 F-16s with which to respond. While there's little chance that Russian attacks will stop in the east, Ukraine having advanced fighter jets may give it enough of an edge in the air that attacks in the west of the country are diminished. The fact that Ukrainian jets and helicopters have been forced to attack cautiously for the entire war means that F-16s and their longer-range weaponry could prove very useful here. Ukrainian pilots have developed a tactic of flying low, unleashing unguided rockets from Ukrainian territory, then immediately backing away to avoid anti-aircraft fire. Russian aircraft use similar tactics but have the advantage of superior firepower, which allows them to fire rockets and gliding bombs from a greater distance. A recent report from the Royal United Services Institute assessed that because of these tactics, even a small number of Western fighters could have a major deterrent effect. While F-16s likely will not grant Ukraine air superiority, they will make the defense of the country's airspace easier, and if paired with JASSMs or similar weapons, provide an important means of launching the type of long-range weapons which are likely necessary to force Russia out of Crimea and other fortified areas. A group of Ukrainian parliament members speaking at the German Marshall Fund in Washington in April said they wanted the F-16 because its radar can locate targets on the ground hundreds of miles away, allowing pilots to stay safely over Ukrainian-held territory while launching weapons into Russian-occupied areas. In addition to defense and deterrence, this also suggests that F-16s could feature in the later stages of the counteroffensive currently underway, which could take the entire rest of the year. Colonel Yuri Inat, a spokesman for the Ukrainian Air Force, seemed to confirm this, telling the New York Times that F-16s could provide cover for Ukrainian troops trying to advance and hold formerly occupied areas. He noted that it could also be used to cut off Russian planes that have started launching guided missiles more than 30 miles from the Ukrainian front line, to defend the sea route that lets Ukrainian grain leave the country and to push further into the Russian-occupied oblasts. All of this helps explain why the Kremlin seems so nervous about the possibility of F-16s in Ukrainian hands. When it became clear that the US would greenlight their training and eventual transfer, Russian diplomats had a minor meltdown. First, Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Rybakov said any transfer of the US jets to Ukraine would be pointless, since Russia's capabilities are more than enough to end the special military operation whenever they want. Now, by this point, we probably don't need to tell you that that's pure BS. When that was pointed out, Russian Ambassador to the United States, Anatoly Antonov, went on to claim that even if the F-16s were transferred, they couldn't possibly be effective, since Ukraine lacks the proper infrastructure, pilots, and maintenance personnel. While this is slightly more true, given the country's incredible adaptability so far, there's no reason to think that Ukraine can't make F-16s work, given the right amount of time and training. The Kremlin knows this, and it seems to be making their threats increasingly desperate. When the statements by Antonov and Rybakov failed to scare NATO or the US, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov took the stage during a speech at a military conference in Tajikistan. He claimed that we must keep in mind that one of the modifications of the F-16 can accommodate nuclear weapons. If they do not understand this, then they are worthless as military strategists and planners. This is obviously pretty ironic considering Russia's continual failures in military planning for the last year, but also shows a deep-seated worry from top officials. They likely don't think that the US would ever give Ukraine nuclear warheads, but know that even if F-16s do not change the battle space in the short term, they will bring Ukraine closer to the West and increase the country's military resilience. The West's response to these threats was also summed up pretty well in the reply to Lavrov by Pentagon spokesperson John Kirby that, if you're worried about Ukrainian military capabilities, then you should take your troops and leave Ukraine. This back and forth over F-16s highlights a larger trend in the war, that Ukraine's warfighting increasingly looks like that of the West, rather than a former Soviet satellite state. Because Russia failed so badly to understand the depth of Ukrainian resolve, every step Putin and his cronies take pushes Ukraine towards NATO, the EU, and the US. By the end of the war, whenever that might come, Ukraine will have extremely close military, economic, and political ties to Europe and America. The F-16s are just the latest part of this broader shift, but the fact that their transfer has been approved is another sign that the Ukraine of 2021 is not the same as the one we see today. War has transformed the country into a major regional military power, with advanced equipment and some of Europe's most battle-hardened troops. Even though Putin somehow hasn't learned his lesson yet, there's no doubt that Ukraine will play a major role in the future of European security. But what do you think? What does the transfer of F-16s to Ukraine mean for the future of the conflict? And will it be enough to overcome Russia's military? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis. After repeatedly asking the US for a few of their MGM-140 Army Tactical Missile Systems, ATACMS for short, Ukrainian forces will finally be getting this long-awaited upgrade to their arsenal. In September, military officials in Washington confirmed they will be sending as many ATACMS over the coming weeks as the US could reasonably spare. And as of mid-October, these high-tech surface-to-surface artillery weapons have been making an impact. But how? In what way? Why are these missiles so crucial for Ukraine compared to other weapons? Let's find out. While offering a special thanks to his friends at the White House recently, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky added that the missiles have more than proven themselves during a pair of synchronized nighttime attacks. Zelensky said that the ATACMS were used against two military airfields, one in Berdyansk and the other in the Luhansk region. a dual strike that resulted in significant losses on the Russian side, including 9 military helicopters, an anti-aircraft missile battery, and an ammunition storage depot. Bolstered by their recent upgrade from Washington, Ukrainian officials have stated plainly that with these new weapons at hand, there will be nowhere left for Russian troops to hide within Ukraine's internationally recognized borders. This pair of attacks was executed shortly after Russia launched a surprise attack on the town of Avdiivka in eastern Ukraine. Encompassing 3 battalions comprised of some 2,000 troops, along with dozens of armored vehicles and a handful of jets providing air support, this would turn out to be the largest assault carried out in this area so far. But this was only the latest flare-up of the ongoing contest for the much-contested municipality of Avdiivka, considered by both sides to be the gateway to the city of Donetsk, the capital of Ukraine's eastern Donbas region. Avdiivka not only has significant strategic importance, but the town has been the stage for many frontline battles since Moscow annexed Crimea 9 years ago, essentially triggering the conflict in eastern Ukraine. Since then, the town has been heavily fortified, making it extremely difficult for Russian troops to establish a foothold there. This has also turned the town, which had a pre-war population of nearly 32,000, but is now down to around 1,600 residents, mostly living in basements and other sub-ground dwellings, into a symbol of the Ukrainian people's unflinching resistance. Ukrainian defensive positions in Avdiivka have allowed its forces to resist repeated Russian attacks, at least for now. At this point, losing this territory would be a tough blow for Ukraine, both strategically and in terms of morale, especially after this summer's highly anticipated counteroffensive resulted in only marginal gains. So why is Biden giving ATACMS to Ukraine such a big deal? Well, for one, Ukrainian forces have so far been able to fend off dozens of attacks, so it will certainly be interesting to see how the arrival of ATACMS missiles on the battlefield shifts the advantage. And for two, the ATACMS will undoubtedly play a crucial role on the battlefield, as Kyiv continues to ramp up its assaults on Russian-occupied areas of Crimea. Recently, Ukrainian forces have expanded their attempts to undermine Russian forces, including the launch of a devastating attack on a Russian naval base in Sevastopol back in September that damaged a ship and a submarine and injured 24 people. And more recently, there was the destruction of the 2 Russian landing crafts by Ukrainian sea drones, an overnight operation that was part of a series of escalating strikes on the peninsula. Ukraine insists that the strikes on Crimea, which have mostly targeted Russian naval bases and vessels, are a critical element of their overall counteroffensive strategy. Ultimately, they want to make it impossible for Russia to continue its assault on the Ukrainian mainland, and in the process, Kyiv is hoping to land a few strategic and symbolic blows against Russian forces, which the ATACMS should certainly help with, as focus shifts back toward Crimea. The escalation of attacks across Crimea began after Russia allowed the Black Sea Grain Initiative to lapse this past July, a globally crucial deal that has allowed Ukraine to export grain by sea. Previously, foreign container ships were allowed to bypass Russia's blockade and navigate safely to Turkey's Bosphorus Strait, then onto global markets. Ukraine's uninterrupted export of grain is vital for stabilizing global food prices and bringing relief to many developing countries. The impact this war, and certainly the collapse of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, has had on global food markets has been disastrous, especially given that Ukraine is a major supplier of food to the World Food Programme, WFP, an international organization within the UN that provides food assistance across the globe. At a glance, Ukraine's contribution makes up 10% of the global wheat market, 15% of the corn market, and 13% of the barley market. It's also a key player in the world's sunflower oil market. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, another organization within the UN, as many as 47 million people could face serious problems in terms of food insecurity as a result of this war. And now, with Russia's Black Sea Fleet resuming its blockade of Ukraine's ports, vital grain exports are being prevented, creating a direct threat to global food security, what Zelensky has simply called another attempt by Russia to weaponize hunger and destabilize the global food market. This situation has left Ukraine eager to secure its position in Crimea, which has meant, along with their missiles and drone strikes, a stepping up of their clandestine operations as well. Recently, in the occupied city of Luhansk, a car explosion killed pro-Moscow former head of police, Mikhail Filipenko. Representatives of Ukraine's defense intelligence have claimed responsibility for the apparent assassination, saying it was a joint operation carried out with pro-Ukrainian partisans. before issuing a warning of retribution to other pro-Russian officials positioned in occupied areas. There was also, quite recently, the bombing of a Russian train outside the city of Ryazan, about 196 kilometers, 122 miles, southeast of Moscow. Placed on a section of track, the improvised explosive device derailed 19 freight cars and caused several injuries. And though Kyiv hasn't officially taken responsibility, that hasn't stopped the Kremlin from making the accusation, citing a series of recent cross-border strikes by Ukrainian forces and their allies. The question seems to be now, other than the success they've already had, how will Kyiv make the most of their new weapon? Ukrainian forces were already familiar with the wheeled M142 high-mobility artillery rocket system, a mobile rocket launcher commonly known as the HIMARS, that are used to carry and fire ATACMS. Up until now, though, the US had only been supplying shorter-range guided rockets, fired from a HIMARS mobile launcher or a tracked M270 multiple launch rocket system, or MLRS. The longest-range variants of the ATACMS can strike targets out to a distance of 300 kilometers, 190 miles. This extension of their reach will more than likely allow Ukrainian forces to launch attacks further into Russian-held territories, including the Crimean Peninsula and other areas bordering the Black Sea. So you might be wondering, besides its impressive range, what's the big deal with ATACMS? Well, to start, most of these 4-meter-long missiles carry a WDU-18 230 kg, 500 pound blast fragmentation warhead. They can travel in excess of Mach 3, around 3,700 kilometers, 2,300 miles per hour, and, depending on which variant you choose, they can cost between $820,000 and $1.7 million apiece. The impressive speed of the ATACMS compared to similar cruise missiles, such as the UK's Storm Shadow or Russia's KH-101, has been one of its key selling points, and is due largely to the fact that the ATACMS is, essentially, a ballistic missile with a rocket engine strapped to its back, which makes them very hard to shoot out of the sky. Okay, so if these high-tech precision missiles come with a rocket engine on the back, what comes at the front? When it comes to the payload carried on the ATACMS, you've really got two options. One is a unitary warhead, which is basically what it sounds like, a single explosive charge. The other is a submunition warhead, a container filled with lots of submunitions or bomblets. These are also mostly what they sound like, a bunch of little bombs that can be dispersed over a large target area. In terms of ATACMS, this means hundreds of steel-cased balls filled with incendiary pellets. So which one is better? Well, it largely depends on your intended target. Unitary warheads are better for destroying specific targets, say a stationary tank, ammunition depot, or a large artillery piece, while submunition warheads will be more effective against moving targets, say a convoy of vehicles or an advancing column of troops. Both warhead variations have been designed with specific target categories in mind, but both can be highly effective against a wide variety of individual targets too. The ATACMS platform also comes with a number of variants, though it's not 100% clear which one President Biden ended up passing on to the Ukrainians. The most widely produced variant is the M39 Block 1, which was added to the US's arsenal in 1991. The original design for this variant had a range of 25 to 165 kilometers, 15 to 100 miles, and carried a payload of 950 incendiary bomblets, each about the size of a baseball and weighing around 0.6 kilograms. And when dispersed above a target, these bomblets can cover an area of 33,000 square meters, 360,000 square feet. Although no longer in production, about 1,650 of the M39 Block 1 variants were made, with several hundred of those being used in combat during both Operation Desert Storm and Operation Iraqi Freedom. All remaining missiles have been modified to carry a unitary fragmentation warhead. But this hasn't been the only variant to be used in combat over the years. With nearly double the range and a GPS-aided guidance system, the M39A1 variant can reach targets anywhere from 12 to 185 miles, 20 to 300 kilometers away, but carries a somewhat smaller payload of just 300 incendiary bomblets. Entering the US's arsenal in 1997, some 610 of these were produced, with around 74 being used in combat, primarily during Operation Iraqi Freedom. This variation is no longer in production, and all remaining units have also had their cluster munition payloads swapped out for a single warhead. Arriving in 2001, the M48 variant, a quick-reaction unitary missile with a GPS-aided guidance system, carries a single 230 kg, 500 pound, high explosive warhead and has a maximum range of 185 miles, 300 kilometers. It should be noted that when a fragmentation warhead, like the one found on this variant and many others, explodes, the blast sends thousands of metallic fragments flying in every direction, much like a 360-degree spray of bullets. Between 2001 and 2004, 176 M48s were produced, 16 of which were used during Operation Iraqi Freedom, while another 42 appeared in combat during Operation Enduring Freedom. The remaining missiles are in the possession of the US Army and Marine Corps. Then there's the M57 variant, which is similar in many ways to the M48, mainly in its ability to carry a single high-explosive warhead out to a distance of some 185 miles or 300 kilometers. Going into production directly after the M48 went out, a little over 500 of these were made, but only 33 have been used in combat, reportedly during Operation Enduring Freedom. The M57 is also very accurate, boasting a circular error probability, CEP, of less than 9 meters, or 30 feet. Typically expressed as a radius, CEP is an important measurement for assessing the accuracy of guided munitions, such as missiles. CEP and missile accuracy in general can be influenced by a range of factors, including guidance system technology and environmental conditions. So essentially, the smaller the CEP, the more accurate the system is considered to be. Let's say, for example, a missile has a CEP of 20 meters. This means there's a high probability, usually greater than 50%, that the actual point of impact will be within a 20 meters radius of the intended target, which means that an M57 ATACMS missile, fired from, let's say, Brussels, Belgium or Dunkirk, could reliably hit the Eiffel Tower, as well as a range of smaller targets located at the same distances. Which brings us to the last variant we're going to look at, but certainly not the least, the M57A1, which is basically identical to the M57 in terms of general specifications and capabilities, except for one major difference. The warhead found on this variant comes with an adjustable blast height, allowing for a wider dispersion of bomb fragments should the situation call for it. After looking more closely at the ATACMS, we can definitely conclude that it has superior speed, range, versatility, accuracy, and explosive power than any other surface-to-surface missile on the market. Its most notable feature, however, might just be the mobility of the system from which it's launched. Because the ATACMS can be launched from a mobile ground vehicle like the HIMARS, which they're already familiar with, Ukrainian troops can easily shoot and then move over a variety of different terrains. Ukrainian combatants can hide if necessary. They can avoid retaliatory attacks. And most importantly, they can create a sense of uncertainty for the Russians, who won't be able to predict where the next strike might be coming from. In practical terms, this means that a Ukrainian mobile artillery unit traveling in an ATACMS-equipped HIMARS could stop basically anywhere, anytime, and launch a precision attack on a target it would take them perhaps 5 to 6 hours to drive to, if they could reach it by land at all. Clearly, Washington's gift of the ATACMS has opened up a range of strategic options for Ukraine's perpetually outnumbered forces, options that could lead to plenty of scenarios where Ukraine has a significant battlefield advantage. The arrival of the ATACMS could very well allow for easier destruction of Russia's air defense systems, airfields, and other military installations deep within the enemy's territory, as we've already seen Ukraine do when they recently used their new missiles to wipe out a pair of Russian air bases. In the wake of this recent news, many of Ukraine's supporters have been quick to applaud Biden's generosity, but it's also important not to get carried away here. Old Uncle Joe didn't just happily hand over a bunch of his precious ATACMS the first time Zelensky asked for them. The folks in Washington have actually been quite hesitant to do so, and for two pretty good reasons. One, there's the risk that significantly increasing Kyiv's fighting ability might also increase the tension between the US and Russia. And two, the US also had its own national security needs to consider, as its stockpile of ATACMS, which have been out of production since 2017, has continued to dwindle. The latter issue, however, keeping enough ATACMS on hand to balance its own security needs with those of Ukraine and Europe as a whole, seems to have been mostly resolved by the recent arrival of a suitable replacement. And it is fancy. In March 2016, Lockheed Martin and Raytheon Technologies announced they'd be working in tandem to develop a missile that would meet the US Army's replacement requirements. This new missile, if it would indeed end up shouldering out the ATACMS, would need not only advanced propulsion, allowing it to fly faster and farther, it would also need to be thinner and sleeker. For what purpose, you ask? So that the loadout could be increased to 2 per pod, doubling the number of missiles that could be carried by the HIMARS or tracked by the M270 MLRS. Well, the Army ultimately got what they wanted, introducing the Precision Strike Missile, or PrSM for short, which has reportedly left production and will be entering US stockpiles in the near future, if it hasn't already. The PrSM, which would ultimately be developed by Lockheed Martin, is at the leading edge of long-range precision strike missiles. With an equally cool-sounding name compared to the ATACMS, this next-generation surface-to-surface weapon uses enhanced attack capabilities to neutralize, suppress, and destroy targets at a distance of 310+ miles, over 499 kilometers. On top of increased range, lethality, in-flight survivability, and missile loadout, the PrSM also comes with an advanced cluster munition warhead comprised of preformed fragments. While the PrSM development program started out as a competitive effort between Lockheed and Raytheon, Raytheon would end up withdrawing from the competition in early 2020 due to technical issues that delayed their missile's flight test. The original intent of both companies was to reach a maximum range of no more than 499 kilometers, due to restrictions outlined in the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, signed by former President Ronald Reagan and former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev in 1987. Among other restrictions, the INF Treaty prevents signatories from developing missiles that can travel 500 kilometers or more, but these limitations went out the window in August 2019, when former President Donald Trump decided to withdraw from the treaty. This decision came after more than a decade of accusations, coming from both the US and Russia, that the other had violated the terms of the treaty. And so, with a brand new long-range precision missile in their arsenal, and who knows what variants on the way, the only thing that will stop Washington from providing ATACMS to Ukraine was Russian President Vladimir Putin's uncertain reaction. In short, he wasn't pleased. So far, Putin has said that the US providing Kyiv with ATACMS was a big mistake, and that the US is wading deeper and deeper into a conflict the Russian leader believes is none of its business. Previously, Putin called the delivery of ATACMS to Ukraine a red line that the US had better not cross. Yet he's also stated that the ATACMS will not make a significant difference on the battlefield, that Russian forces will have no trouble repelling attacks, and this intrusion by the US will only serve to prolong this war and bring more suffering to the people of Ukraine. But this isn't the first time Putin has brought up the subject of long-range missiles. When Russia initially marched more than 100,000 troops to the border of Ukraine, 2 months before they invaded, the Kremlin also sent NATO a list of demands that was structured as more of a one-sided treaty, along with the articles insisting that NATO both shuts its doors to new members and remove all its forces from the 14 countries that joined after the Soviet Union collapsed. One article declares that no land-based missiles be deployed to areas that would allow them to reach any territory belonging to Russia. Technically, the missiles haven't gotten closer, their range has just increased, but still, this was the red line Putin was referring to. But now that it's been crossed, the Russian president doesn't seem overly concerned. This could be because he was expecting it, or because the delivery of the ATACMS, however significant their future impact could be, is only a small part of a much larger delivery from the US, a delivery that's come to exceed $76 billion in humanitarian, financial, and military support, which has been offered to Ukraine by the Biden administration and the US Congress since the war began. While dozens of other countries have also provided large aid packages to Ukraine, including most members of NATO and the European Union, the US has really taken the lead. So far, the US has delivered surveillance and attack drones, coastal defense ships, satellite communications equipment, and advanced surveillance and radar systems. They've sent over hundreds of Abrams tanks and artillery pieces, thousands of Humvees and other tactical vehicles, tens of thousands of rockets, missiles, and various other munitions, not to mention several types of anti-aircraft missiles, including 12 National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile Systems (NASAMS), and 1 Patriot Air Defense Battery plus munitions. And on top of 35,000 grenade launchers and small arms with ammunition, other extremely helpful but less publicized items the US has sent to Ukraine include night vision and thermal imagery systems, laser rangefinders, C4 explosives, explosive ordnance disposal equipment, M18A1 Claymore mines, cold weather gear, and generators. Breaking down the numbers, around $3.9 billion, or 5% of the total, has gone to humanitarian aid in the form of emergency food assistance, healthcare, and refugee support, among other resources, while another $26.4 billion, or 34%, has gone to financial and budgetary aid via loans and the Economic Support Fund, an economic assistance fund used to advance the US's political and strategic interests by helping allied countries meet their political, economic, and security needs. And the rest of that $75+ billion, that's all gone directly or indirectly to weapons, ammunition, and military equipment. Nearly a quarter of the total, around $18.3 billion, has been allocated for security assistance in the form of training, equipment, weapons, and logistics support provided via the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, a program initiated by the US Department of Defense with the intention of providing help to Ukraine by enhancing its defense capabilities and mitigating certain security challenges, mainly a Russian invasion. Another $23.5 billion worth of weapons and military equipment has come directly from the DoD's personal supply. And still another $4.7 billion has come in the form of grants and loans for weapons and equipment via the Foreign Military Financing Program, another US initiative, this one providing grants and loans to nations so they can purchase weapons, defense equipment and services, and military training from the US through government-to-government sales. Long before crossing Putin's metaphorical red line with his delivery of ATACMS, Biden also stirred up the hornet's nest, as well as some international controversy, when he agreed to furnish Ukraine with cluster munitions, which most countries have banned due to the increased risk their use poses to civilians by 1. Their lack of precision, and 2. The danger of undetonated ordnance being triggered accidentally later on. Still, a number of analysts in the West have asserted that the assistance offered by the US, as well as its allies, has been crucial in Ukraine's continued defense, and has even created the opportunity to launch a number of critical counteroffensives against Russia. Some analysts, as well as many supporters of Ukraine, also believe the country's failure to expel Russia will result in the subjugation of millions of Ukrainians, while simultaneously fueling Putin's ambitions to recover territory that once belonged to the former Soviet Union, which might also end up encouraging China to pursue or enhance similar aggressive tactics, which means military support for Ukraine will likely continue. To a significant degree, though it has certainly not been alone, the US has led the world in offering security assistance to Ukraine. Their javelins have halted Russian tanks during their savage assault on Kyiv. Their air defense systems have intercepted Russian strikes aimed at Ukrainian infrastructure. The US has also provided financial and humanitarian assistance, which has helped Ukraine maintain highly fundamental services such as healthcare and heat. Many NATO members, including the US and other allied nations, have, too, been cautious about getting directly involved in the conflict, being concerned primarily with Putin's not-so-subtle threats of starting a nuclear war. As we've seen, however, governments across the world have overcome their initial hesitancy and provided Ukraine with increasingly sophisticated assets, including battle tanks, modern fighter aircraft, and now, high-tech, long-range precision missile systems. But what do you think? Has the US crossed a line by sending ATACMS to Ukraine? Should NATO and its allies simply stay out of it? Are we inching closer to a global nuclear conflict instigated by Russia? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. In Ukraine's battle for air supremacy with Russia, a swarm of tiny Black Hornet drones might just give it the edge. These drones act as eyes for Ukrainian troops on the ground, and thanks to the US, UK, and Norway, Ukraine now has an entire fleet of them ready to be deployed at a moment's notice. In July 2023, the United States announced that it would deliver $400 million in security assistance to Ukraine. Beyond the typical armored vehicles and air defense missiles, that package would also include Black Hornet drones made by Teledyne FLIR Defense. A month later, the UK made a similar announcement. Working with Norwegian manufacturers, it would spend $9 million on these micro-drones, sending them over to Ukraine for use as covert surveillance tools. All told, Ukraine now has over 1,000 of these drones at its disposal, and they're helping Kyiv slowly turn the tide against Putin's invading forces. But how? How could a tiny drone, designed to look like a helicopter, have such a huge impact? To answer that question, we must start by asking the following. What are Black Hornet drones? The simple answer is they are miniature unmanned aerial vehicles, or UAVs, that are designed specifically for reconnaissance. Unlike many of the other drones that Ukraine uses, some of which come equipped with attack capabilities, the Black Hornet drone is all about stealth. But that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to its superpowers. The first generation of these drones was created in 2011 by Teledyne FLIR and quickly found themselves in heavy use in Afghanistan. They're designed to be small enough for ground-based troops to carry. They even come with their own carry case, and they can be deployed at a moment's notice. In Ukraine's case, they've received shipments of the Black Hornet 3, which measures just 6.6 inches from nose to tail and weighs only 1.16 ounces. In other words, they're tiny. So tiny, in fact, that the drones are easy to hide among foliage and trees, making them almost imperceptible to opposing troops unless the drones are flown straight into them. Furthermore, the drones are designed to be practically silent when in operation. The telltale buzzing that usually accompanies these types of UAVs isn't present, making it even harder to detect the Black Hornet. Also, unlike other drones, the Black Hornet does away with the quadcopter design that's typically used for UAVs. Instead, it looks like just a tiny helicopter, only one that's equipped with several high-definition cameras that are capable of sending footage to the operative controlling the drone. That design choice also means that Black Hornets can squeeze through much smaller gaps than quadcopter UAVs, ideal for sneaking into buildings and navigating difficult terrain. The Black Hornets have an impressive 25-minute flight time, giving the user plenty of time to get in and out with the drone, and takes about the same amount of time to recharge. As a result, the drone can be deployed several times per day, with each flight revealing more about the area over which it flies. But all of that tech doesn't come cheap. The most recent publicly available pricing for the drone puts it at $195,000 per unit. Given that Ukraine has received about 1,300 of the drones since the beginning of Putin's war, that would mean that Kyiv's Black Hornet fleet has cost $2.73 billion to date. That's a lot of money to spend on a fleet of tiny helicopters, but it's money well spent once you recognize the extent of the Black Hornet's abilities. First, there's the simple ease of deployment to consider. Unlike traditional drones, which often need to be launched from the ground and will weigh down any troops carrying them, the Black Hornet is so tiny that it can be launched from a soldier's hand. Seeing one take off is almost like watching somebody launch a toy helicopter. Just place it on a surface and hit a button. The drone zooms into the air to be directed by the soldier's remote control from the ground. That simplicity makes it a weapon of immense power. Granted, the Black Hornet has no attack capabilities, meaning it isn't a weapon in the traditional sense, but the fact that it can be launched by anyone from almost anywhere gives it a level of versatility that most drones simply don't offer. A platoon of soldiers could send several of them into the skies in an instant, giving them a clear bird's-eye view of the terrain below. And when the Black Hornet is done, it can be landed right back on the soldier's hand and tucked into a pocket. However, the miniature nature of the drones does come with some downsides. When the British first started using the Black Hornet in Afghanistan in 2013, they found that something very simple could cause issues: a gust of wind. According to one soldier, a good gust of wind will send the Black Hornet off, meaning that Ukraine's soldiers face some limitations when using them. Still, those limitations aren't quite as severe as what the Brits faced. Back then, the Black Hornet weighed just 16 grams, making it easy to knock off course. The third generation of the device, the one being sent to Ukraine, is a little heavier and is now capable of standing winds of up to 17.3 miles per hour. That's more strength than the Black Hornet used to have. However, according to the Beaufort wind scale, a 17.3 mile per hour wind qualifies as a moderate breeze. If the wind is strong enough to raise dust from the ground or rustle loose paper, it's probably strong enough to knock a Black Hornet off course. Rain can also be an issue. According to Teledyne FLIR's specifications document, the Black Hornet can handle precipitation of 0.1 inches, which qualifies as a light rain. Anything above that means the rain is so heavy that the tiny drone can't fly properly, meaning it's best deployed when conditions are clear. Still, it has a solid temperature range of between 14 and 109.4 degrees Fahrenheit, making it usable in freezing cold conditions and extremely hot locations. Having a weapon that can be overcome with a decent gust of wind or a little bit of rain might not seem like the best idea in the world. But the Black Hornet makes up for that design issue, which is inherent in something as small as the drone, with amazing stealth capabilities. The drone comes equipped with a set of tiny electronic motors that are battery-powered and combined with the aerodynamic design to make it extremely quiet when it's in the air. The drone is practically silent, with almost none of the telltale buzzing seen in other UAVs. That's ideal for its use to surveil hostile environments. Even a slight amount of background noise serves as enough cover to make the Black Hornet drone almost impossible to hear. According to engineering.com, a soldier will have no idea it's even there as long as the drone stays more than 10 feet away from them. That near silence is complemented by a smart design to emphasize control. Assuming the drone flies in relatively windless conditions, its slight wing shape, coupled with a design inspired by birds and insects, means it can be controlled almost perfectly. The drone can turn on a dime, with little to no build-up needed to get it to navigate corners. Again, that makes it useful in stealth operations, as a soldier can quickly fly the Black Hornet around a corner or behind a tree to prevent anybody from being aware of its presence. The vortex generators installed on the Black Hornet's wings play a large part in improving the drone's handling. These generators create small vortices of air localized to small portions of the wings that allow for easier control when the drone is moving at slow speeds. The generators also reduce stall speeds, allowing the user to quickly slow down and, when conducting surveillance, to have the drone hover in place so it can get clear shots of its surroundings. Better yet, the drone can fly up to heights of 1.5 kilometers, approximately 0.93 miles, again allowing for quick escapes. Then there are the Black Hornet's image capturing capabilities to consider. The drone often comes in sets of two, with one being equipped with cameras to capture daytime footage, while the other specializes in shooting footage at night. The unit comes with a pair of electro-optical, or EO, cameras, one at the front and one that shoots footage below the drone that can capture video at a 640 by 480 resolution. If a soldier wants to take photos of the environment, those EO cameras can send back pictures with a resolution of 1600 by 1200, strong enough to record even the smallest of details on the battlefield. The thermal imaging cameras built into the nighttime versions of the drone aren't as powerful. They deliver video and images at a resolution of 160 by 120. That's enough to get a general idea of how many troops may be in a location, for instance, though not detailed enough to deliver any specifics. All imagery and video can be recorded or streamed live to a tablet operated by the user, with the Black Hornet having a radio range of 1.24 miles. That's more than enough for covert operatives to maintain their distance from a target while surveilling it. Best of all, every scrap of the drone's recorded footage is encrypted and stored on a 64GB SD card that can be easily removed or replaced as needed. The same goes for the cameras, all can be replaced with spares if they happen to go offline for any reason. The manufacturers have gone to great lengths to ensure that the cameras are easy to use. With the tablet that comes with the Hornet, a soldier can simply tap a screen to take a snapshot, all while watching streamed video. It's almost like playing a video game. Using the tablet and a remote control, the user moves the drone around, hitting a button to take snapshots whenever they're needed. But what if a soldier doesn't want to put themselves at risk while controlling the drone? Thanks to the Black Hornet's advanced artificial intelligence, or AI systems, they don't have to. Each Black Hornet comes equipped with an autonomous navigation mode that allows the user to pre-program a flight route into it. That programming means it can fly to its target without being directly controlled, with the drone even having the ability to return to its dock automatically when it senses that it's running out of juice. The AI built into the drone is also able to adapt to changing environmental conditions. That's ideal if wind or rain pushes it off course. Using its AI, the Black Hornet can course correct, so it gets back onto its intended flight path. This autonomy is achieved through a small array of onboard sensors built into the drone, which help it to detect obstacles nearby so that it doesn't accidentally collide with them. Advanced GPS built into the drone also makes it easy to set a route. Simply choose a location, and the drone can use its GPS systems to figure out the best way to get there. All of that data that the Black Hornet picks up via its sensors is fed through complex AI algorithms, enabling it to fly safely without anybody being in direct control. There's even an optional visual-based navigation unit that the drone can use to fly indoors when it has no access to GPS. So it's an impressive piece of technology. But how has Ukraine been using the Black Hornet? The clear and most obvious use is for reconnaissance and surveillance. As Ukrainian troops advance on Russian positions, they can deploy the drones ahead of themselves to get the lay of the land before they launch operations. And thanks to the drone's high-resolution cameras, they can track Russian troop movements easily, figuring out the best times and places to strike. Think about this potential scenario. A Ukrainian platoon advances to the edge of a Russian position. Hiding out of sight, a soldier launches a Black Hornet and sends it flying high above the Russians, where the drone spends about 20 minutes recording footage and sending snapshots. Immediately, the Ukrainians can see how many soldiers are stationed at the Russian position, as well as get detailed imagery of artillery and other weapons. They'll also see weak points. Any gaps in the Russian defense can be picked up by the Black Hornet. with the drone being small enough to fly in and out of buildings, as well as around rubble, to locate an ideal attack position. And as one drone runs out of power and has to return to the soldier who launched it, another drone can be sent into the skies to replace it. That's where the drone's small size becomes a massive advantage. According to The Economist, a single Ukrainian platoon has 20 soldiers. Each of these soldiers could easily carry a Black Hornet, delivering about 400 minutes of surveillance footage per platoon. A small fleet of Hornets could easily surveil an entire Russian station in minutes, with the footage being stitched together to reveal everything about what the platoon will face when it launches its attack. The Russians would have no idea that the Hornets are even above them. It's this ability to surveil that also helps Ukraine to knock Russian jets out of the sky. The Black Hornet is so tiny that it simply doesn't show up on a jet's radar, and even if a pilot spots it, the jet won't be able to do a thing to destroy the drone. The Black Hornet is far more maneuverable. Before the pilot could even adjust their jet to fire on it, the drone would be gone, likely heading back to its user. And just like that, the Ukrainians would know exactly where the jet is and the flight path it's taking. The Russian pilot would have two choices: either abort their mission and turn back, risking the wrath of Moscow by failing to complete their objective, or carry on flying, likely into Ukrainian anti-air defenses, and risk losing their plane and their own life. It's a lose-lose situation. Assuming the pilot even sees the Black Hornet tracking them, the likelihood is that they won't, meaning the Ukrainians can launch their anti-air attacks before the pilot even realizes what's happening. These scenarios aren't outside the realms of possibility. According to the European Council on Foreign Relations, or ECFR, Ukraine used the larger TB2 drone to help it target the initial Russian convoy that tried to ride into Kyiv. It's also believed that a TB2 was used to distract the defenses of the Moskva ship, giving Ukrainian soldiers enough time to fire the naval missiles that ultimately sank the Russian vessel. With the Black Hornet, Ukraine has an even smaller drone at its disposal, one that will help targeting without ever being spotted by the enemy. Consider also the propaganda uses of the Black Hornet. Recording footage of Russian troop movements may be useful for Ukrainian attacks, but it also shines a light on what those troops are doing as they advance. Every atrocity committed, every civilian killed. If a Black Hornet is present, it can all be filmed and distributed, helping Ukraine to make an even better case for why the rest of the world needs to help them overcome the Russian threat. And thanks to the Black Hornet's high-resolution snapshots and high-quality video feeds, there will be no doubting any of the footage the drone shot. Again, this is a proven Ukrainian tactic. Kyiv has used drones to document the destruction of several Ukrainian cities during the war, as well as the breaching of the Kakhovka Dam. It also uses drones to record its own attacks against Russian ships, tanks, and jets, all valuable morale-boosting propaganda to spread among its forces. There's also the simple fact that using drones protects troops. In the case of the Black Hornet, that's been a proven benefit of these UAVs since they were first deployed in Afghanistan. Newsweek made that clear when it shared the comments of Major Adam Foden, a British soldier who used them during his time fighting against Afghan insurgents. Previously, we would have sent soldiers forward to see if there were any enemy fighters hiding inside a set of buildings, he said. Now we are deploying Black Hornets to look inside compounds and to clear a route through enemy-held spaces. Ukraine is doing the same. Every Black Hornet deployed accounts for one soldier who doesn't have to risk their life to surveil a Russian position. Ukraine gets to protect its troops, who can stay over a mile away from a Russian position, while still receiving a clear video feed that shows them exactly what they need to know. This risk reduction means that a Ukrainian platoon doesn't have to take any chances and lose valuable members just to figure out how to launch an attack. It can use Black Hornets and attack at full strength every single time. However, using the Black Hornet doesn't come without risk. That was made clear in a July 2023 article published in Bulgarian Military, which said that soldiers from Russia's Wolves Brigade, a reconnaissance unit, had captured two of the drones. Both were seized during a shootout in Novaya Tavlzhanka that resulted in the Russians managing to retain the trophy control complex. That was a significant event. The Black Hornet is made using proprietary technology to which the Russians don't currently have access. Teledyne FLIR isn't selling to them, which means they can't fill the skies with swarms like the Ukrainians can. Yet. Now that they have a pair of these drones, Russia can try to reverse engineer them to figure out the science and tech behind how they work. Whether they'll be successful or not is another matter. The Black Hornet uses encryption to protect the videos that it shoots, so you have to assume that it has even more powerful encryption guarding the AI algorithms and subroutines built into its system. But even if it takes Russia years to come up with its own version of the Black Hornet, the fact that it has the tech in its hands makes the process a little more straightforward. And even if Moscow decides not to go down the reverse engineering route, it can at least use this pair of Hornets. It can figure out their capabilities and, possibly, figure out a way to counter them. Or with more captures, it may be able to build up a small fleet that it can use to plan attacks of its own in the future. The Ukrainians could start to see their own tech being used against them if they're not careful. Still, the use of Black Hornet drones has been a massive boom for Ukraine in its fight against Russia. The tiny drones have enabled Ukrainian soldiers to get the jump on Moscow's finest in more than a few conflicts, and have been valuable for capturing footage used for reconnaissance and even propaganda purposes. The only question we have left is simple: what does the future hold? Right now, the Black Hornet is relatively harmless in terms of its attack prowess. In short, it has none. There are no weapons built into the drone, meaning it exists solely to capture footage and shoot photos. But the potential exists to make it a much more dangerous device. Imagine a world where Teledyne FLIR decides to build a version of the Black Hornet that doesn't have a full array of cameras. Instead, they load it up with an explosive device, one that can be triggered from over a mile away, or thanks to the AI algorithms in the drone, programmed to explode once the Black Hornet reaches its location. The drone would become a silent killer. By the time the target realized that the drone was even there, it would be practically on top of them. It's only visible from 50 feet against a perfectly clear backdrop. You can only hear the minor buzzing the drone produces if the Black Hornet is 10 feet away. Could we see the war delve into scenarios where soldiers are constantly on the lookout for these miniature drones, taking potshots at any they see to prevent them from causing serious damage? Perhaps militaries will start to counter these drones with new tech that surrounds their installations with simulated winds and rainwater, preventing the Black Hornets from penetrating. Only the future will tell. For now, the Black Hornet is one of the most powerful weapons Ukraine has at its disposal, even if it's not technically a weapon. It gives troops clear sets of eyes in the sky, eyes that can work day and night, that provide valuable information for missions. Added to the many other drones that Ukraine is using, as well as the many that its civilians use to capture footage for their own military, and Putin's war may go down in history as the first to truly feature drone warfare. So what do you think about the Black Hornet? Is this impressive little device everything that it's cracked up to be, or do you see flaws that could be overcome in the future? Maybe you have some other ideas about how it may be used to Ukraine's advantage. Tell us what you think in the comments, and thanks for watching the video.